The politician behind Athenian democracy was trying to win a political fight. The city that built the most beautiful building in the ancient world paid for it with other people's money. One of the greatest philosophers in Western history was executed by a democratic vote. And the civilization that gave us the word freedom ran on slave labor. Same place, same people, same institution. This is ancient Greece. Not the highlight reel of columns and marble. The real story is messier, more violent, and more human than most people were taught. How did one small, fractured, frequently violent peninsula produce ideas so powerful that every civilization after it is still arguing about them? That is the question this documentary answers. The answer will not be comfortable, but by the time we reach the end, you will understand why that is exactly what makes it matter. Chapter 1. Before Greece. The world that made it possible. Imagine that everything you have spent your life building is gone in a single generation, not declining slowly the way empires usually fade, not lost through accumulated bad decisions across centuries. Gone. The palace where your grandfather administered the grain supply, burned to its foundation. The writing system your scribes maintained through years of specialized training, forgotten so completely that within 50 years, no living person can read it. The trade networks that connected your city to Egypt, to Cyprus, to the Syrian coast, collapsed as if they had never existed. The population of your region, reduced by perhaps 3/4 within the span of a human lifetime. This is not imagination. This is what happened across the eastern Mediterranean around 1150 BCE, and the civilization that eventually grew from those ruins. Slowly and painfully, across 3 centuries of near total darkness, became ancient Greece. To understand why Greece became what it became, you first have to understand what was destroyed to make room for it. Go back to roughly 2000 BCE, the island of Crete, sitting about 100 miles south of the Greek mainland, is home to a civilization most people today have barely heard of. The Minoans, named by modern archaeologists after the legendary King Minos, built something genuinely remarkable on that island. Their palace complex at Knossos covered nearly 20,000 square meters. It had indoor plumbing, it had multi-story construction with light wells designed to move air through interior spaces. Its walls carried frescoes of such technical confidence that when the British archaeologist Arthur Evans first uncovered them, beginning in 1900 CE, he initially struggled to accept they were as ancient as the stratigraphy indicated. The Minoans were not Greek in any recognizable sense. Their language, preserved in a writing system modern scholars call Linear A, remains only partially understood despite decades of serious effort by specialists. What is clear from the archaeological record is that they were the dominant maritime and commercial power of the early Aegean, threading the Mediterranean with trade connections that reached Egypt, the Levant, and Cyprus. By the standards of the 2nd millennium BCE, they were cosmopolitan in ways their successors would spend centuries trying to recreate. Then, sometime around 1500 BCE, something went catastrophically wrong. The volcanic island of Thera, roughly 70 miles north of Crete, erupted in one of the largest volcanic events in recorded human history. The historian Bettany Hughes, in her work on the ancient Mediterranean, describes the Theran eruption as having regional consequences severe enough to disrupt the agricultural and commercial systems the Minoans depended on. Whether the eruption alone destroyed Minoan civilization, or whether it weakened it enough that other pressures finished the work, is a question the archaeological evidence has not yet definitively resolved. What the archaeology confirms is the outcome. By around 1400 BCE, the great palaces of Crete were burned and abandoned. Into the space the Minoans had occupied came a people from the Greek mainland who had been building their own civilization in the Minoan shadow. The Mycenaeans are the people Homer wrote about. Agamemnon, who led the Greeks to Troy in the Iliad, was a Mycenaean king. Achilles was a Mycenaean warrior. Whether the Trojan War happened in anything resembling Homer's account is a question historians continue to debate without reaching consensus. What is not in question is that the Mycenaeans were real, that their civilization was sophisticated and heavily militarized, and that they dominated the Aegean world for several centuries from fortified palace cities at Mycenae, Tyrenes, and Pylos. Their walls were so massive that later Greeks, who had no memory of building them and no explanation for how they had been constructed, attributed them to the Cyclopes. The mythological giants they assumed were the only beings capable of moving stones that large. When the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann excavated Mycenae in the 1870s, he discovered shaft graves containing golden death masks and quantities of worked bronze and gold that confirmed these were not simply prosperous chieftains. They were rulers of genuine organizational scale. The Mycenaeans had their own writing system, called Linear B, which was deciphered in 1952 by a British architect and self-taught linguist named Michael Ventris. The decipherment revealed something significant. Linear B was an early form of Greek. The Mycenaeans were linguistically the direct ancestors of the classical Greeks. Their surviving tablets, numbering in the hundreds, record not poetry or history or religious speculation. They record sheep counted, bronze allocated, grain distributed. The oldest texts in the Greek language are inventory spreadsheets. And then, at a date, scholars place roughly around 1150 BCE. It was all gone. The Bronze Age collapse is one of the most dramatic and most debated events in ancient history. Within roughly 50 years, virtually every major palace civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed entirely or was severely disrupted. The Hittite Empire, powerful enough to fight Egypt to a standstill for decades, ceased to exist. The great trading city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was burned and never reoccupied. Cyprus suffered devastating destruction, and the Mycenaean palace centers, On by On, went dark. The historian Eric Klein, in his study of the Bronze Age collapse, published in 2014, argues against looking for a single cause. He makes the case for what he calls a systems collapse, a situation where multiple stressors operating simultaneously overwhelmed civilizations that had become so deeply interconnected that failure in one part cascaded through all the others. Severe drought, which paleoclimatological evidence suggests was sustained across the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. Disruptions to the trade networks that palace economies depended on, internal social pressures, and the movements of peoples that Egyptian records describe, groups whose precise identity and motivations remain debated by specialists. What Klein's framework captures is the specific fragility that complexity creates. The Mycenaean palace economies were sophisticated precisely because they were deeply integrated with the broader Bronze Age trading world. When that world began to fracture, the sophistication that had made them prosperous became a vulnerability. They had optimized for a stable system. When the system failed, they had nothing to fall back on. The period that followed, from roughly 1100 BCE to 800 BCE, is called the Greek Dark Ages by modern historians. The name is not rhetorical. Linear B writing disappears from the archaeological record almost immediately after the collapse. Population estimates based on archaeological evidence suggest the number of people living in the Greek world dropped by perhaps 75% in some regions within 2 or 3 generations. Settlements shrank to fractions of their former size. Long-distance trade essentially stopped. The material record shows a sharp decline in the quality and variety of pottery and metalwork. The knowledge of how to write was lost entirely for roughly 300 years. The Greek-speaking world left no written records at all. But here is what the darkness was actually doing. Invisibly, during those 3 centuries, the palace system had been built on an assumption so fundamental that no one inside it would have thought to question it. That organizing human communities at scale required a center, a palace, a king, an administrative apparatus that directed agricultural production and military service and craft specialization from the top. Every major Bronze Age civilization operated on this assumption. The center organizes, everyone else produces and obeys. The collapse destroyed the centers, and what emerged in their absence, slowly and without any directing intelligence, were communities that had learned to function without one. The archaeologist Ian Morris, in his long-term study of Greek history and material culture, published in 2010, tracks this transformation through burial evidence across the Dark Age period. He identifies a pattern significantly more egalitarian than anything Mycenaean archaeology shows. With the vast wealth differentials visible in shaft graves, largely absent from Dark Age burials, Morris is careful not to romanticize this finding. The Dark Age was not egalitarian because people had chosen equality as a philosophical value. It was egalitarian because the mechanisms for accumulating and defending large-scale wealth had collapsed along with everything else. But the effect was real regardless of its cause. Communities of roughly equal small-scale landholders, none of them powerful enough to dominate the others through sheer economic weight, had to develop other mechanisms for making collective decisions. And the mechanisms they developed, through practice and argument, and the gradual accumulation of custom across 3 centuries, were the earliest roots of what would eventually become Greek political culture. The gathering place, the open space at the center of a community where people assembled to talk about things that affected them all, not to be told what the palace had decided, to argue about it together. The historian Josiah Ober, in his detailed study of Athenian democracy, published in 1989, traces the roots of democratic practice precisely back through this Dark Age assembly tradition. His argument is that democracy was not invented in 5th century BCE Athens by a specific reformer who had a theory of popular sovereignty and implemented it. Democracy was the formalization and scaling up of practices that Greek communities had been developing for 300 years before anyone thought to give them a name. That changes the story fundamentally. Democracy was not a gift from above. It was a habit developed in the dark, by people who had lost everything else and had to figure out how to live together without any of the old structures to tell them how. Then, around 800 BCE, 2 things happened that transformed what those habits could become. The Phoenicians, the trading people of the Lebanese coast, had developed a consonantal alphabet, encoding the sounds of consonants while leaving vowels to be inferred from context. The Greeks adapted this system and did something transformative. They reassigned certain Phoenician consonant signs to represent Greek vowel sounds, creating the first fully phonetic alphabet in human history. a system where every sound in the spoken language had a corresponding written symbol. A fully phonetic alphabet can be learned in days rather than years. It requires no specialist scribal class to maintain. And one of the first things the Greeks used their new writing for was not administrative records and not religious texts. It was law. The earliest surviving examples of Greek alphabetic writing include legal inscriptions, statements of what the community's rules were, carved in stone and placed in public spaces where anyone could read them and anyone could cite them. A law written on a stone in the agora could be appealed to by anyone, including someone challenging the powerful. It transformed law from the expressed will of whoever currently held power into something that existed independently of any individual. Writing law down was a constraint on arbitrary power. And communities that had been developing the habit of public argument in their agoras found in written law a tool that made that argument more durable and more equal. This is where the story of ancient Greece truly begins. Not with the palaces of Mycenae, which were magnificent and are gone, but in the wreckage they left behind. In 3 centuries of darkness that stripped away the elaborate structures of the Bronze Age and left ordinary people on difficult ground, figuring out for the first time what they owed each other and who got to decide, the question they were asking, in those small communities on those rocky hillsides, was the most important political question in human history. Who should have power? And why? Everything that followed, the democracy and the tyranny and the philosophy and the war and the ideas that are still running today, was an attempt to answer it. Chapter 2. The Dark Age and the Invention of the Polis. In 900 BCE, in a community of perhaps 200 people on a hillside somewhere in central Greece, a dispute is happening. 2 farmers share a boundary that one of them believes has been moved. It is not a large dispute by the standards of any later period in Greek history. There is no written record of it, no court to appeal to, no distant authority with the power to resolve it. What there is everyone else in the community, assembled in the open space at the settlement's center, listening to both men make their case. This gathering will not produce a sophisticated legal judgment. The community's sense of what is fair, shaped by custom and by the particular social debts each man has accumulated over years of living alongside neighbors, will probably determine the outcome more than any principle. The stronger man, or the more respected man, or the man with more allies present, probably has an advantage. But something is happening here that did not happen in a Mycenaean palace. Both men are speaking. Both men expect to be heard. The assembled community understands itself as having a legitimate role in resolving the dispute, not simply as an audience for a decision already made elsewhere. That expectation, unremarkable in this small community on this particular morning, is the seed of everything. The word agora, in its earliest Greek usage, simply means a gathering, a place where people come together. Before, it was a marketplace. Before it was an architectural feature of designed civic space. It was a practice. The practice of assembling to talk about collective decisions. The habit of believing that outcomes depended on argument. That the quality of what you said in front of your neighbors mattered. That being heard was not a privilege, but an expectation. The archaeologist Ian Morris, tracking burial patterns and settlement sizes across the Dark Age period, identifies something that becomes clearer in retrospect than it could have been at the time. The communities that survive the long darkness and emerge into the archaic period with the most political vitality are consistently the ones that developed, in various forms, this culture of participation, not because anyone designed it, because the conditions forced it. When there is no palace to tell you what to do, you develop other ways of deciding. The city-state, the polis, that emerged from this period was not primarily an architectural achievement. It was a social achievement. A community small enough that politics was personal. A space where you could see the people making decisions that affected your life. Where you could speak to them in public, challenge them in front of their neighbors, and have your challenge mean something because the audience was present and the audience had stakes in the answer. By the 8th century BCE, the polis was taking physical shape across the Greek world. A defensible height, the Acropolis, where the community's most sacred buildings would stand. Below it, the open gathering space of the Agora. Around them, the residential and commercial life of a community that understood itself as a unit with shared obligations and shared stakes in collective outcomes. What made the polis genuinely new in human political history was not its size or its architecture. It was the specific kind of identity it created in the people who lived inside it. In a Mycenaean palace economy, the subject was someone to whom things happened. Tax collectors arrived. Labor demands came. The palace decided what would be grown in which fields. A citizen of a polis was, in theory and increasingly in practice, someone who participated in deciding what would happen, not a subject. A citizen. The word politikos, from which we get political, simply means pertaining to the polis. Politics, in its Greek original, was not a specialized activity conducted by professionals in distant buildings. It was the daily practice of living together in a specific community and managing the decisions that living together required. Every male citizen was, by definition, a political being. Not participating was the aberration. Engagement was the expectation. Now add alphabetic writing to this picture and understand what it made possible. When the Greeks began inscribing laws on public surfaces around 800 BCE, they were doing something with political implications that went far beyond the immediate practical convenience of having rules written down. The historian Rosalind Thomas, in her work on literacy and orality in ancient Greece, argues that the Greek alphabet's structural accessibility, learnable by any motivated person without years of specialist training, created possibilities for broad literacy that no previous writing system had offered. Literate communities that wrote their laws on public stones were communities where the law could be cited by anyone who could read it, where the powerful family that had always administered justice according to their own interpretation of unwritten custom now had to defend that interpretation against a text that anyone could point to. This was not immediately revolutionary. The early archaic world remained heavily dominated by aristocratic families who controlled land, administered justice, and embedded their authority in religious ritual and genealogical prestige that written law alone could not simply override. But written law created a permanent basis for challenge, and a basis for challenge, in a culture already developing the habit of public argument, was a tool that accumulated power over time. The structural tension that would drive Greek political history from roughly 700 BCE to 500 BCE was the gap between two things that the emerging polis contained simultaneously. On one side, aristocratic families converting economic advantage into political dominance through the same mechanisms that had always produced hierarchy: control of land, control of courts, control of religious practice. On the other side, a majority of farmers and craftsmen and traders who had voices in public assemblies and found those voices systematically overridden by the organized weight of aristocratic networks. The first significant political expression of this tension was not reform. It was tyranny. The word tyrannos, in its Greek original, meant a ruler who had seized power outside established frameworks, typically by building popular support among the non-aristocratic majority and using it to displace the ruling families. It carried no automatic connotation of cruelty. That connotation accumulated over time through specific experiences. Cypselus of Corinth, who seized power around 657 BCE, built his popular support among farmers and craftsmen that the ruling Bacchiad clan had dominated and exploited for generations. He drove the Bacchiads out, redistributed their property, and presided over a period of commercial expansion that made Corinth one of the wealthiest cities in the Greek world. His son Periander continued his policies, patronized the arts, and ruled for approximately 40 years. By the standards of the era, the Cypselid tyranny at Corinth was, for most of its duration, a period of genuine prosperity and relative civic stability. Phidon of Argos standardized weights and measures in his region, making commercial transactions more predictable and harder for powerful families to manipulate in their favor. Polycrates of Samos built a navy that dominated Aegean trade and undertook engineering projects that ancient writers described with genuine admiration, including a tunnel nearly a kilometer-long cut through solid rock to supply the city with fresh water. These were not the tyrannies of monsters. They were the tyrannies of capable politicians who understood a simple political arithmetic. There were more people outside the aristocratic inner circle than inside it. Organizing those people around a specific leader who delivered tangible benefits was a viable path to power. And the aristocratic families whose position depended on exclusive access to political decision-making could not simply wish that arithmetic away. But every tyranny contained a structural failure that no individual ruler's competence could permanently solve. The tyrant's power rested on personal authority and popular loyalty rather than institutional legitimacy. It was held together by the specific person who had built it. When that person died, the succession was always contested. The historian Kurt Raaflaub, in his work on the origins of democracy, published in 2007, identifies a pattern in the aftermath of tyrannies that matters enormously for what came next. The communities that expelled their tyrants almost never restored the old aristocratic order intact. They had seen that personal rule was unstable. They had seen, in the aristocratic dominance that preceded the tyrants, that hereditary rule was unjust. What they were groping toward, without theoretical framework or historical precedent, was a form of political organization that distributed power broadly enough that no single person or family could seize it completely. The polis was the container for that groping. The agora was the space where it happened. While the mainland city-states were working through this tension, the Greek world was simultaneously expanding in ways that would shape the classical period as fundamentally as any political development. Between roughly 750 BCE and 500 BCE, Greek communities sent colonial expeditions across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea with a regularity and a geographic reach that transformed the ancient world. They went west to Sicily and southern Italy, a region the Romans would later call Magna Graecia because of the density of Greek settlement. They went north and east to the shores of the Black Sea, founding cities at sites that became modern Trabzon and modern Sevastopol. They went south to Egypt, where the pharaohs granted them a trading settlement. They founded the city that is modern Marseille. They established communities on the coast of Spain. The causes were multiple and interacting. Population pressure was real in a landscape where agricultural land was limited and already distributed. Trade drove expeditions to commercially strategic locations. Political conflict sent losing factions looking for new ground rather than accepting permanent defeat at home. What the colonization movement did to Greek political culture was arguably more important than any material benefit it produced. It created generation after generation of Greeks who had done something that most ancient peoples never did. They had left. They had crossed open water to an unfamiliar coast and built a polis from nothing, and communities that had to consciously construct their own institutions that could not simply inherit them from existing structures, were communities that understood what their institutions were for in a way that communities with centuries of inherited practice sometimes did not. The historian Irad Malkin, in his study of Greek colonization published in 2011, argues that the colonial experience was central to the formation of Greek identity precisely because it forced the question of what being Greek actually meant when you were somewhere that was not Greece. The practices that marked Greek identity, the specific forms of religious ritual, the athletic competitions, the particular ways of organizing a polis, became more consciously valued in colonial settings because they were what distinguished the Greek settlement from surrounding non-Greek populations. A people who have to explain their identity understand their identity. The colonization movement made Greeks think about what made them Greek. That self-consciousness fed directly into the philosophical tradition that would eventually produce the most systematic examination of political and moral questions the ancient world attempted. By 600 BCE, the Greek world was a network of several hundred polis stretching from the Black Sea to Spain, each conducting its own political experiment, each working through its own version of the same fundamental tension between the few who had always held power and the many who were increasingly insisting that this arrangement was neither stable nor just. Two of those experiments, conducted in two cities about 50 miles apart in the same corner of Greece, were about to produce answers so different from each other and so complete in their internal logic that the contrast between them would define Greek history for the next 2 centuries. Athens would choose one kind of answer. Sparta had already chosen another. Understanding each answer on its own terms, before passing judgment on either, is the only way to understand what Greece actually was. Chapter 3. Archaic Greece, Colonization, Tyranny, and the First Experiments. In 733 BCE, by the reckoning most modern historians accept, a group of people from the city of Corinth loaded their possessions into boats and sailed west toward an island they had heard about, but most of them had never seen. They were not romantics setting out for adventure. They were people who had run the numbers and concluded that the risk of crossing 300 miles of open water was preferable to the certainty of staying home and slowly losing ground to families with more land, more connections, and more patience for excluding rivals. They were leaving because the political arithmetic of Corinth had no solution that benefited them. The new place might. They landed on the eastern coast of Sicily and founded a city they called Syracuse. 2 centuries later, Syracuse would be one of the largest and most powerful cities in the Greek world. The city that would defeat the greatest military expedition Athens ever assembled, humbling the most famous democracy of the ancient world in a catastrophe that nobody on that Sicilian shore in 733 BCE could have imagined. But none of that was visible yet. What was visible was a patch of coastal ground, unfamiliar terrain, and the immediate practical problem of building a community from nothing. How you solve that problem reveals what you actually believe about how communities should work. The Greek colonial movement's answer, replicated hundreds of times across the Mediterranean over 2.5 centuries, was always some version of the same thing. You bring the polis with you, the assembly, the agora, the written laws, the religious festivals, the particular practices that made a community, rather than simply a collection of people occupying the same territory. You reconstruct the political form you know because it is the only form you know how to build. This had an intellectual consequence that is easy to miss. A community that has to consciously construct its own institutions, that has to decide explicitly and in real time which laws to adopt and how to organize its council and what the rules of citizenship will be, is a community that understands what its institutions are for. The colonists of Syracuse were not inheriting their political arrangements from ancestors who had worked it all out generations ago. They were building them. And communities that build their institutions from scratch tend to ask a question that communities with centuries of inherited practice rarely think to ask. Why this way and not another? That question, once asked, does not stay confined to colonial settings. It travels back along the trade routes to the mainland. It gets asked in Corinth and Athens and Sparta and Miletus and every other city where someone has encountered a community that solved the same problems differently and returned home wondering which solution was actually better. The philosopher and historian G.E.R. Lloyd, in his comparative study of Greek and Chinese scientific thought, published in 1987, identifies the adversarial public culture of the Greek polis. The culture of public argument where claims required justification and justification could be challenged by anyone present as a specific, enabling condition for the kind of systematic questioning that eventually produced both Greek philosophy and Greek political innovation. He is not arguing that the Greeks were smarter than other ancient peoples. He is arguing that specific social conditions produced specific intellectual habits. The agora that trained citizens to argue about taxation and military alliances also trained thinkers to argue about the nature of reality and the foundations of justice. The pre-Socratic philosophers, the thinkers who came before Socrates and asked different kinds of questions than he did, are usually presented in popular accounts primarily as proto-scientists who proposed natural explanations for natural phenomena. And they were that. Thales of Miletus, active around 585 BCE, proposed that the fundamental substance underlying all phenomena was water. Anaximander proposed an indefinite substrate he called the apeiron. Heraclitus of Ephesus, writing a generation later, proposed that the fundamental principle of reality was not a substance at all, but a process. Change itself, expressed in his observation, preserved in ancient sources, that you cannot step in the same river twice. Whether those specific proposals were correct matters less than the move they represent. They were proposing natural explanations for natural phenomena, not which God was responsible. What the physical reality actually was. That move, natural explanation for natural events, sounds obvious from inside a civilization that has been making it for 2,500 years. It was not obvious in the world where it first appeared. Most human cultures across most of human history have explained natural events through supernatural agency. The Greeks made the move to natural explanation and made it explicitly enough that it could be transmitted and developed. The lyric poets of the 7th and 6th centuries BCE were doing something related but different. Sappho of Lesbos, whose surviving fragments represent only a fraction of what she wrote, produced poetry of such technical precision and emotional directness that later Greek critics ranked her alongside Homer. She wrote about desire and loss and the specific texture of individual experience with a personal voice that the epic tradition, with its focus on heroes and collective destinies, had not developed. Archilochus of Paros wrote about warfare with a sardonic honesty that cut directly against the heroic ideal. He wrote about throwing away his shield and running from battle, and treated this not with shame, but with wry pragmatism. The shield was replaceable. He was not. These were not simply literary innovations. They were a culture developing the intellectual tools for first-person examination, a culture beginning to ask not just what happened and what the gods intended, but what it means to be a specific human being in a specific community with specific obligations and specific limits. That question, explored in verse by the lyric poets, was about to receive its most consequential political expression back on the mainland. The tension between aristocratic privilege and popular participation was building toward its first major resolution. And before we follow Athens and Sparta to their distinct answers, we need to understand the general phenomenon that shaped so many Greek cities in the Archaic period. The tyrants who emerged across the Greek world in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE were not all the same, but they shared a structural position. They were strong individuals who built popular support among the non-aristocratic majority and used that support to break the grip of the families whose hereditary control of land and courts and religious authority had become the central political fact of their communities. Some were effective administrators. Some were genuinely brutal. Most were somewhere between those extremes. What distinguished the most consequential among them was not their particular policies, but the long-term political effect of their arrival and departure. When a tyrant came to power, the aristocratic consensus that had maintained political exclusion was broken. When a tyrant fell, as they almost always did within 1 or 2 generations, the question of what should replace him was open in a way it had not been before his arrival. The old aristocratic order was discredited. The personal rule of the tyrant was also discredited. Something genuinely new was required. That requirement felt differently in different cities and answered differently in different political cultures. Is the engine driving Greek political innovation in the 6th century BCE. It is why the period that feels, from the outside, like simple instability, was actually producing the institutional experiments that would eventually change the world. The Greek world was ready for something new. The question was what? Sparta had already built its answer. In reforms so radical and so complete that they created a civilization unlike anything that had existed before. Athens was still working toward its answer. Through a sequence of partial solutions and political crises that would span a full century before the decisive institutional breakthrough arrived. To understand what both cities chose, and why those choices produced the conflict that would nearly destroy the Greek world, you have to understand each answer on its own terms first. Chapter 4. Sparta, the state that chose a different answer. Picture a 7-year-old boy on the morning he is taken from his mother. He is not being taken by strangers. The men who have come for him are known figures in the community, part of the same system his father served, and his grandfather before that. His mother has known this morning was coming since the day he was born. When a different group of men came to the house and made the first decision about his future, whether he would live or be left on the hillside to die, he passed that examination. He has had 7 years with his family. Now the second phase begins. He enters the agoge. He will not sleep in his family's home again for 13 years. The word agoge means roughly the upbringing, and it was the central institution of Spartan society, the mechanism through which the city reproduced itself, not merely biologically, but psychologically. What it was designed to produce was not simply a physically capable soldier. It was designed to produce a man who did not primarily experience himself as an individual at all, but as a component of a collective whose survival was more important than any member's personal welfare. Boys in the agoge lived in communal barracks with their age group. They slept on reed mats they had to cut themselves from the riverbank. They were deliberately underfed and encouraged to supplement their rations by stealing from farms and kitchens in the surrounding area. If they were caught stealing, they were beaten, not for stealing, for being caught. The lesson was explicit. Resourcefulness and concealment were valuable skills. Getting caught was evidence of inadequate development of those skills. They were beaten in other contexts too, including ritual competitions, specifically designed to test their capacity to endure pain without making a sound. The purpose was not cruelty as an end in itself. The purpose was to discover, before the situation became life or death, which boys could absorb suffering without breaking. The answer to that question was worth knowing. The historian Paul Cartledge, in his extensive study of Spartan society, published in 2001, describes the agoge as one of the most thoroughgoing systems of state-controlled socialization in the ancient world, a system designed to replace individual identity with collective identity at a psychological level, not merely to train soldiers, but to produce men for whom the distinction between self and state had been systematically dissolved. To understand why Sparta built this system, you have to understand the event that made it feel necessary. Sometime around 720 BCE, Sparta went to war with the Messenians, who occupied the fertile Pamisos River Valley to the west. The Messenian Wars, which ancient sources place across multiple generations, ended with a Spartan victory so complete that it permanently changed the nature of Spartan society. The Spartans did not simply defeat the Messenians. They enslaved the entire population of a conquered Greek territory and reduced them to the status of helots, state slaves bound to the land, required to hand over a fixed portion of their agricultural production to the Spartan citizens who nominally owned the estates they worked, prohibited from leaving, and subject to systematic violence that ancient sources describe consistently enough to make clear this was policy rather than individual excess. The institution known as the Crypteia sent young Spartan men into the countryside at night, armed, with explicit authorization to kill any helot they encountered. The historian Thucydides, our most reliable source for much of the classical period, describes an episode in which the Spartans identified 2,000 helots who had distinguished themselves by bravery in military service, honored them in a religious ceremony that implied recognition, and then made them disappear. No one ever knew what happened to them. The message to every other helot was precise. Distinction was dangerous. Ambition was fatal. Sparta formally declared war on the helots every year, so that killing a helot was legally not murder. Ancient sources give estimates of the ratio of helots to Spartan citizens that range widely, and modern historians note that precise figures from antiquity should be treated with caution given the absence of systematic census data from this period. What the sources consistently agree on is that helots substantially outnumbered Spartan citizens, probably by a significant margin, which is what made the security problem so acute and the military solution so all-consuming. The agoge was not only military training, it was the Spartan response to that permanent internal security crisis. An army of citizens so cohesive, so disciplined, and so psychologically committed to collective survival that the helot population could never find the moment of internal fracture they would need to exploit. The men who completed the agoge were assigned to communal dining groups called syssitia, messes of approximately 15 men who ate together every day for the rest of their lives. Membership required the unanimous approval of existing members. A single blackball was enough to exclude a man. A man without a mess had no standing in Spartan civic life. The mess was the basic social unit, the group where daily loyalty was forged and daily identity was maintained. Spartan women occupied a position so different from women elsewhere in Greece that ancient observers regularly commented on it. They exercised publicly. They managed households and estates with real authority because their husbands were either campaigning or eating in the mess. They were expected to be physically strong because stronger women were understood to produce hardier children for the state's purposes. Ancienne tradition, preserved in Plutarch, writing centuries after the events and drawing on earlier sources whose reliability cannot be independently confirmed, describes Spartan mothers sending sons to war with the instruction to return carrying their shields or to be carried back on them. Whether the line was ever spoken in precisely those words, it captures something real about the emotional demands the Spartan system placed on its women. The political structure governing this society was, by Greek standards, unusually stable. 2 kings simultaneously, drawn from 2 separate royal families, shared military and executive authority in a way that prevented either family from accumulating unchecked power. A council of 28 elders, over 60 years of age, plus the 2 kings, served as the primary deliberative body. 5 magistrates, called ephors, elected annually from the citizen body, exercised oversight over the kings themselves. Aristotle, analyzing Spartan governance in the 4th century BCE, described it as a mixed constitution that had solved the problem of concentrated power more durably than most Greek cities managed. He was right that it was durable. For roughly 2 centuries, from the consolidation of the Lycurgan reforms to the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, no Greek army defeated a full Spartan force in pitched battle. The psychological weight of Spartan military reputation was itself a strategic asset that reduced the number of battles Sparta actually had to fight. Communities submitted to Spartan demands because the alternative was a Spartan army. And a Spartan army was something no sane commander wanted to face on its own terms. Here is the question that Sparta forces any honest observer to confront. Did it work? By the measures Sparta used to evaluate itself, the answer is yes. For approximately 2 centuries. By other measures, the picture is considerably more complicated. The Helot system was a crime of the kind that history requires naming clearly. The systematic violence against an entire population held in hereditary slavery was not an unfortunate side effect of an otherwise admirable system. It was the foundation on which the system rested. The agog, whatever military excellence it produced, was a program of systematic psychological transformation applied to children who had no choice about participating. The exposure of infants judged physically inadequate was institutionalized infanticide, and the Spartan system produced, in terms of cultural output, almost exclusively soldiers. The archaeological record from Sparta is genuinely impoverished in artistic and literary production compared to Athens in the same period. The Spartans chose, deliberately and systematically, to direct their collective energy toward military excellence and away from everything else. That choice produced a civilization of extraordinary military power and extraordinary cultural narrowness simultaneously. The ancient writer Plutarch, our most detailed source for Spartan customs, wrote about them with a mixture of admiration and discomfort that reflects genuine ambivalence across his work. He admired the discipline and the civic commitment. He found the treatment of helots troubling and the exposure of infants disturbing. That ambivalence is the historically accurate response to a civilization that was simultaneously impressive and morally catastrophic. Every society produces the citizens its institutions are designed to produce, Sparta produced soldiers because it built institutions designed to produce soldiers. Athens, 50 miles away, facing some of the same political pressures and some different ones, built different institutions and produced something very different. To understand what Athens chose and why the contrast matters so much for the world that came after both cities, you have to understand what problem both cities were actually trying to solve. Because the problem was the same. How do you organize a community of people who have voices and opinions and genuine stakes in collective outcomes in a way that does not collapse into either the exploitation of the many by the few or the paralysis of everyone by a single consensus? Strong man who decides the rules should serve him. Sparta found one answer. Athens found another. Both answers worked for a while. The tension between them shaped the next 2 centuries of Greek history. And the question of which answer was actually better is one that Western civilization is still arguing about. Chapter 5. The Birth of Democracy. Cleisthenes, Solon, and the Athenian Experiment. Here is the fact that almost no popular account of democracy's invention tells you. The man who created the institutional framework of Athenian democracy did so because he was losing a political fight and needed new allies. He was not a philosopher implementing a theory of popular sovereignty. He was an aristocrat in a power struggle. And the side he turned to when his own side was losing was the side with the most members. The side with the most members was the people. His name was Cleisthenes. He came from one of Athens' oldest and most prestigious families, the Alcmaeonids, a lineage with a history of political brilliance and political scandal stretching across generations. In 508 BCE, he was competing for dominance with a rival aristocrat named Isagoras. Isagoras had Spartan backing. Isagoras was winning. Cleisthenes made a decision. He went to the people. The historian Herodotus, our earliest and most important source for this period, uses a specific Greek word to describe what Cleisthenes did. He says Cleisthenes took the demos, the people, into his atyria. His political faction. The word is the language of tactical alliance, not idealism. Political calculation. Cleisthenes offered the Athenian people a restructuring of political life so fundamental that the aristocratic networks giving Isagoras his power would be permanently disrupted. But to understand what Cleisthenes built and why it lasted, you first have to understand what came before him. Because the democracy of 508 BCE did not arrive without preparation. It was the third act of a reform process that had been running for nearly a century. The first act was Draco, in 621 BCE. A man named Draco became the first Athenian to write down the city's laws. The act sounds straightforwardly progressive. The content was another matter. The Athenian orator Demades, writing centuries later, said that Draco wrote his laws not in ink, but in blood. And the tradition almost certainly exaggerates. But the core of it reflects something real about a law code that prescribes severe punishments across a wide range of offenses. Whether every specific detail ancient sources record about Draco's code is accurate cannot be confirmed from available evidence. And modern historians treat the ancient accounts of its harshness with appropriate caution. But the function was real and consequential, regardless of the specific content. By writing laws down and placing them in public, Draco transformed law from whatever the powerful currently said it was into something fixed and citable. Anyone could read it. Anyone could argue from it. That shift in the nature of legal authority was more important than any specific provision. The second act was Solon. In approximately 594 BCE, the Athenian community granted extraordinary emergency powers to a man named Solon to address a crisis that was threatening to tear Athens apart from the inside. The crisis was debt slavery. Athenian farmers who had fallen into debt to wealthy landowners were being reduced to bound laborers, required to work their creditors' land as a condition of the debt. In the most severe cases, debtors were being sold abroad into permanent slavery to satisfy obligations they could not repay. This was not a fringe problem. It was widespread enough to produce genuine social panic. Citizens with legal standing in the community were losing the economic independence that citizenship was supposed to guarantee. Solon canceled existing agricultural debts outright. In a measure he called the Sisachteia, the shaking off of burdens. He freed all Athenians who had been enslaved for debt. He brought back from abroad those who had been sold into foreign slavery to satisfy debts. He prohibited debt slavery going forward as a category. And he restructured political participation to make wealth, rather than birth, alone the criterion for holding public office. That last reform sounds less dramatic than it was. The connection between aristocratic lineage and political power had been, until that moment, the fundamental assumption of Athenian governance. By formally replacing birth with wealth as the criterion for office, Solon broke that assumption. A wealthy man from a non-aristocratic family could now hold office. That had not been true before. And principles, once broken formally, have a way of being pushed further by the people who benefit from having broken them. Solon also established or significantly strengthened the Heliaea, a popular court where large juries of ordinary citizens decided legal cases, and enhanced the authority of the assembly of all male citizens to serve as the final court of appeal in important matters. Solon himself was not a democrat. When asked afterward why he had not given the poor more power than he had, he reportedly answered that he had given them as much as was good for them. That paternalism proved insufficient. The tensions his reforms addressed did not disappear. They shifted, and the shifting produced the sequence of tyrannies and political crises that characterized the second half of the 6th century BCE in Athens. Peisistratos, an aristocrat who had built popular support among Athenian farmers, seized power as tyrant in 561 BCE. He was expelled, returned, was expelled again, and returned a third time around 546 BCE, maintaining power until his death in 528 BCE. By ancient accounts, he was an effective ruler who maintained Solon's laws formally, sponsored public building programs, promoted the Panathenaic festival in ways that created shared civic identity across Athens's different social groups, and presided over commercial expansion that made Athens more prosperous and more physically impressive. His sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, inherited his position. Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BCE. Hippias, surviving the attack, became increasingly repressive. In 510 BCE, the Spartans expelled him, responding to requests from Athenian aristocratic exiles led by the Alcmaeonid family. Which brings us back to Cleisthenes, and to the power struggle with Isagoras, and to the decision that changed the world. Isagoras, backed by Sparta, was initially stronger. He managed to have Cleisthenes and his allies formally exiled, but Cleisthenes had already put his proposals before the Athenian assembly, and the assembly had responded with an enthusiasm that Isagoras had not anticipated and had not planned for. When Isagoras attempted to dissolve the boule, the council that Cleisthenes had proposed creating, the council refused to dissolve. The citizens of Athens, according to Herodotus. Mobilized without a leader directing them, they besieged the Acropolis where Isagoras and his Spartan supporters had retreated. The Spartans, facing a popular uprising of a kind they had not encountered before and were not equipped to suppress in a foreign city, withdrew under terms. Isagoras fled with them. Cleisthenes returned. That moment deserves to be held for a moment rather than simply narrated past. The citizens of Athens, ordinary citizens, farmers and craftsmen and merchants, had physically defended an institutional arrangement that gave them power. They had not been led to do so by a charismatic individual. They had done it because the institutions Cleisthenes proposed served their interests, and they understood that clearly enough to fight for them before those institutions even fully existed. The historian Josiah Ober, in his study of the Athenian Democratic Revolution, published in 1996, argues that this spontaneous mobilization was not incidental to the democratic revolution. It was constitutive of it. The people exercised power to defend democracy before democracy was institutionalized. That exercise of power was itself part of what made democracy real, rather than simply a set of proposals that could be reversed by the next powerful faction. What Cleisthenes then built was the institutional architecture of Athenian self-governance, and the specific design choices he made reveal a sophisticated understanding of how political structures shape political culture over time. The central problem he faced was this: Athenian political life was organized around kinship networks, families, clan, the webs of connection and obligation through which aristocratic families mobilize support and maintain dominance. As long as political identity was organized around kinship, the families with the most extensive and prestigious networks would have a permanent structural advantage that formal legal equality alone could not overcome. Cleisthenes abolished the old tribal organization as the basis for political participation and replaced it with 10 new tribes, each constructed to cut across the existing social geography in ways that made kinship-based political mobilization structurally much harder. He divided Attica into roughly 140 units, called demes, local communities that were essentially villages and urban neighborhoods. He organized these demes into 3 regional groups: the city, the coast, and the inland areas, and assigned demes from each of the 3 regions to each of the 10 new tribes. The result was that each tribe contained members from different geographic areas and different social backgrounds. A man's tribe was no longer his family's tribe or his neighborhood's tribe. It was an artificial unit that mixed him with people he might never have met under the old arrangements. The tribes became the organizing units for military service, jury service, council membership, and religious festivals. Men who served together in the same tribal regiment, who sat together in the same section of the council, who participated together in the same religious ceremonies, developed loyalties that ran to their tribe and through it to the city, rather than to the kinship network of a specific aristocratic family. Cleisthenes also created the boule, the Council of 500, with 50 members drawn from each of the 10 tribes by lot, serving for 1 year. Membership was open to any male citizen over 30, chosen by lot, with no individual serving more than twice in a lifetime. This meant that over the course of a generation, a very large proportion of Athenian male citizens would have direct personal experience of governing. Political knowledge and political responsibility were being distributed across the citizen body in a way that no previous political system had attempted. The assembly, the ecclesia, was open to all male citizens and met regularly to debate and vote on legislation, foreign policy, and matters of public concern. Any citizen could speak. Any citizen could propose a measure. Decisions were made by majority vote of those present. Any citizen could speak, in front of thousands of his peers, about decisions that affected all of them. Think about what that meant in the world of 500 BCE. A farmer from a village in inland Attica could walk to the Pnyx, the hillside where the assembly met, stand up before thousands of his fellow citizens, and make an argument about a matter of policy. No family connection required. No aristocratic sponsor necessary. Citizenship was the only credential. That was new. That had not existed before. That is one of the most important moments in the political history of our species. The democracy Cleisthenes created in 508 and 507 BCE was not the full democracy of the classical period. It did not yet pay citizens for participation, which meant the poor had limited practical ability to take time off work for civic engagement. The radical democratization of the courts came later, under Ephialtes in 462 BCE, and the democracy excluded, emphatically and without apparent controversy among the male citizens who designed it, all women, all enslaved people, and all non-Athenian residents, regardless of how long they had lived in the city. These exclusions are not footnotes. They are central to any honest account of what Athenian democracy was. A political system that extended genuine and remarkable participatory rights to perhaps 1 in 6 people living under its jurisdiction, while denying those rights entirely to the other 5 in 6, is a system built on a contradiction that its own principles could not justify. The leisure that allowed Athenian male citizens to spend days in the assembly and on juries was financed by the labor of enslaved people. The political equality that Athenian men enjoyed was partly constituted by the sharp exclusion of everyone who was not an Athenian male citizen. The intellectual and cultural life of the Golden Age was enabled by an economy that required coerced labor at its foundation. The historian Ellen Makesons Wood, in her study of Athenian political economy, published in 1988, argues that this contradiction was structural rather than accidental, built into the foundations rather than a peripheral feature that Athenians simply failed to notice. Understanding this does not require judging the Athenians by standards they had no way of accessing. They operated within a moral framework shaped by their time and their specific circumstances. As every civilization has, what it requires is seeing Athenian democracy as it actually was, genuinely revolutionary in ways that changed the world, genuinely limited in ways that the revolution itself could not acknowledge. Both things are true. They were always true. And the history that chooses one and ignores the other is not the complete history. Before Athens could have Socrates and Sophocles and Plato and the Parthenon, it had to survive. And survival, in the world of 500 BCE, required confronting something that no institutional innovation had prepared it for. From the East, from the largest empire the ancient world had yet produced, a force was assembling that would force every Greek city to answer a question more urgent than any question about the proper form of government: whether Greece would exist at all. Chapter 6. The Persian Wars. When Greece should have lost. Stand on the plain of Marathon in September of 490 BCE and look at what you are facing. On your side, roughly 10,000 Athenian citizen soldiers and approximately 1,000 allied troops from the small city of Plataea. No cavalry, no archers of any significance. Men who left their farms and workshops weeks ago to stand on a flat coastal plain between 2 hills, facing an enemy that had already absorbed empires larger than anything the Greek world had ever produced. On the other side, a Persian expeditionary force. Modern historians, working from the ancient sources while acknowledging those sources, give no figures that can be verified independently. Estimate somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 men, including professional cavalry and massed archers who could devastate an infantry force that advanced slowly across open ground. Behind that force stood the resources of an empire stretching from modern Pakistan to modern Bulgaria, governed by Darius the Great, whose title was not hyperbole. He governed perhaps 40 million people. The entire Greek world contained perhaps 2 million. Your general, Miltiades, has fought in the Persian service. He understands the Persian tactical system better than any other Athenian alive. He is telling you to attack, not to wait for reinforcements from Sparta, which are coming but have not arrived. To attack now, at a run, fast enough to close the distance before the archers can deliver the kind of sustained barrage that has broken armies before yours. The strategy is not irrational. Against heavy infantry that advances slowly, Persian archers are devastating. Against heavy infantry that closes at speed, they are significantly less effective. Miltiades is betting that the shock of unexpected aggression, combined with the armor advantage of Greek hoplites at close range, can overcome the numerical disadvantage. He is also betting your life. The Athenians charged. They covered the roughly 1 mile of open ground between the two armies at a run. The Persian center pushed through the Greek center. The Greek wings held, drove their opponents back, then turned inward and collapsed on the exposed Persian center from both sides simultaneously. The Persians broke toward their ships. The Athenians pursued them to the water, ancienne source. Most importantly, Herodotus, writing some decades after the battle and drawing on accounts from survivors and participants, give the Persian dead as approximately 6,400 and the Athenian dead as 192. Modern historians treat specific ancient casualty figures with caution. Given the absence of systematic counting methods in ancient warfare and the natural tendency of victorious traditions to emphasize lopsided outcomes, the broad scale of the disparity is consistent with what we know about the dynamics of pursuit after a force breaks. But the specific numbers should be understood as estimates rather than precise counts. The Athenian dead were buried on the battlefield in a mound called the Soros. It is still visible today. A low earthen rise in the coastal plain, standing in more or less the same place where the arithmetic of a desperate morning worked out in ways it had no obvious reason to work out. Marathon was not the end of the Persian threat. It was the beginning of a decade of preparation for a confrontation that anyone paying attention understood was inevitable. Darius died in 486 BCE before he could organize his response. His son Xerxes spent 4 years assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had yet seen. Ancient sources give figures for the Persian army that reach into the millions, numbers that modern historians consider rhetorically inflated well beyond any logistical possibility for the ancient world. Modern estimates range widely, from around 100,000 to several 100,000. Figures that remain extraordinary in the context of Greek military capacity, even at the lower end of the range. Xerxes built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont so his army could march from Asia into Europe. When a storm destroyed the first bridge, he had the engineers responsible executed and, according to Herodotus, ordered the strait symbolically whipped as punishment for its disobedience. A second bridge was built. The army crossed. The man who made Athenian naval resistance to this force possible was a politician named Themistocles. In 483 BCE, Athens discovered a rich new vein of silver at the mines at Laurion, producing a significant windfall of public revenue. The conventional use of such a windfall would have been to distribute it among the citizens, which was within the assembly's power to decide. Themistocles argued instead for using it to build a fleet of 200 new warships. He framed the argument around a local conflict with the island of Aegina, a more immediately compelling justification than the Persian threat, which, he understood, would eventually require those ships regardless of what happened with Aegina. The historian Thucydides, writing later, describes Themistocles as a man of exceptional foresight who saw further ahead than his contemporaries in most political and strategic matters. Whether that assessment precisely reflects his capabilities or is shaped by retrospective knowledge of how things turned out cannot be fully determined. But the naval proposal's eventual consequences speak for themselves. The Athenian assembly voted to build the fleet. Those 200 triremes required approximately 40,000 rowers, the majority drawn from the Thetes, the poorest class of Athenian citizens, who had previously been largely excluded from military service because they could not afford the bronze armor and weapons of the infantry soldier. The fleet expansion brought the poorest Athenians into the military and therefore into the full social standing that military service conferred. The navy was built by the democracy, and it deepened the democracy in the process of being built. When Xerxes' army crossed into Greece in 480 BCE, the Greek strategy was to contest his advance at successive choke points where Persian numerical advantage would be reduced or neutralized. The first of those choke points was a mountain pass in northern Greece called Thermopylae. The events at Thermopylae have been retold so many times and with such dramatic compression that the popular tradition has added considerable material to the historical record. The Greek force that held the pass was not 300 Spartans fighting alone. It was approximately 7,000 men from multiple Greek states, including Thespians, Corinthians, Phocians, and others alongside the Spartan contingent. The Spartan force was led by a king, Leonidas, which gave the defense genuine prestige and demonstrated Spartan commitment to the Allied effort. The legend of 300 against millions reflects how ancient and modern traditions have compressed the event for dramatic effect rather than the operational reality. The battle lasted 3 days. For 2 days, the Greek force held the pass. The Persian army, compressed into a narrow front where its numbers could not be deployed effectively, took casualties against heavily armored infantry fighting in terrain that suited them. On the third day, a local resident led Persian forces through a mountain path that bypassed the pass entirely. When Leonidas understood his position was about to be surrounded, he dismissed most of the allied contingents. The Spartans, the Thespians who chose to stay, and a Theban contingent remained and were overrun and killed. The 3 days bought time for the Greek fleet to engage and learn the Persian fleet's capabilities at Artemisium, time for evacuation of threatened territories, time for the strategy Themistocles had developed to be implemented. That strategy required Athens to do something that most of its citizens found nearly incomprehensible: leave. The oracle at Delphi had told the Athenians, in the indirect language the oracle always used, that they would be saved by a wooden wall. Themistocles argued the wooden wall meant the fleet. Others argued it meant the wooden fence around the Acropolis. The debate was not simply about interpreting ambiguous prophecy. It was about whether Athens was a place or a people. Themistocles won the debate. The Athenian population evacuated to the island of Salamis and to the Peloponnesian coast. A small group chose to remain on the Acropolis and defend it. The Persian army entered Athens, killed the defenders, and burned the temples on the Acropolis. And then, in the narrow water between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast in late September of 480 BCE. The Greek fleet destroyed the Persian fleet, ancien source, including Herodotus and the playwright Aeschylus, who participated in the battle himself, described Themistocles engineering the engagement at Salamis by sending a message to Xerxes, warning that the Greek fleet was about to escape and urging him to block the strait. Whether this message was sent, and whether it significantly influenced Xerxes' decision to commit his fleet to the narrow water, is debated by modern historians. What the sources agree on is that the Persian fleet entered the strait and was defeated there. In confined water, the faster and more maneuverable Greek triremes could not be overwhelmed by mass. The Persian fleet lost the ability to use what made it dangerous. Xerxes watched from his throne on the shore. He withdrew with the bulk of his army shortly afterward. The following year, at Plataea, in 479 BCE, a Greek coalition army defeated the Persian land force that had wintered in northern Greece. The Persian threat to mainland Greece was over. The historian Tom Holland, in his study of the Persian Wars, published in 2005, engages carefully with the counterfactual that the Persian Wars inevitably raise. What would have happened if Xerxes had won? The honest answer is that Persian victory would not necessarily have destroyed all of Greek culture. The Persian Empire had absorbed sophisticated civilizations before and permitted them to function under administration. Greek religious practice, Greek artistic traditions, possibly elements of Greek philosophical inquiry might have survived in modified forms. What would almost certainly not have survived is the specific political experiment of democratic Athens. The Persian Empire had no interest in popular self-governance among subject peoples. It had every reason to prefer compliant local elites. A Persian-controlled Athens would not have been the Athens that produced Sophocles and Euripides and Socrates and Plato and the political theory that Western civilization has been arguing about ever since. The Persian Wars gave the Greeks something more than military survival. They gave them the ideological framework within which they understood their own political arrangements as valuable and worth defending, rather than simply normal. The contrast between Greek freedom and Persian despotism, between citizen soldiers fighting for their own community and subject soldiers fighting for a king's command, became a recurring touchstone in Greek political argument and cultural production for the rest of the classical period. That contrast corresponded to a real difference between the political systems involved. It also became a frame that Athens eventually used to justify things the frame did not actually justify. The Athenian Empire that grew from the Persian War victory was built on the same logic of superior Greek freedom, and applied that logic to allies and subject peoples that Athens dominated with increasing heaviness as the 5th century progressed. But before the empire and its consequences, before the war that consumed the Golden Age, there was the peak itself. And the peak was extraordinary enough that 2,500 years later, people still travel from every country in the world to stand on a hill above Athens and look at what remains. Chapter 7. The Golden Age, Athens at its peak and its price. In 447 BCE, on the flat summit of the Acropolis above Athens, a construction project began that the people overseeing it understood was unlike anything attempted before. The commission was a temple to Athena, patron goddess of the city, to replace the temple the Persians had burned when they occupied Athens in 480 BCE. The architects were Iktinos and Callicrates. The artistic direction belonged to the sculptor Phidias. The political will, the financial resources, and the vision of what this project was supposed to mean came from the man who dominated Athenian public life for 30 years. His name was Pericles. The building they created is the Parthenon, stand in front of what remains of it today, damaged over millennia, stripped of its gold and ivory cult statue, missing most of its sculptural decoration, partially reconstructed, and you are still looking at one of the most sophisticated acts of architectural design in human history. The columns are not straight. They lean very slightly inward. The floor is not flat. It curves very gently upward toward the center. The columns are not cylindrical. They swell almost imperceptibly in their middle section, in a refinement called entasis. The horizontal elements that appear straight to the eye are actually slightly curved. None of these are mistakes. They are corrections. The architects understood that perfectly straight lines at large scale appear to the human eye as slightly curved, that perfectly flat floors appear to sag, that perfectly cylindrical columns appear to taper too quickly. So they built the deviations that make the building appear more perfect than geometric perfection would produce. They were building not for an abstract standard, but for the specific perception of a specific human being standing in front of the finished structure. They knew the difference between what was geometrically true and what was perceptually true, and they chose the latter. That choice tells you something essential about what the Golden Age was. It was a civilization that had learned to build for human experience rather than abstract correctness. Pericles came from the Alcmaeonid family on his mother's side, the same family that had produced Cleisthenes. He entered Athenian political life in the 460s BCE as an ally of Ephialtes, the radical democrat who in 462 BCE stripped the Areopagus, the ancient council of former archons that had retained significant political functions, of most of its powers, and transferred them to the popular assembly and the popular courts. This reform completed what Cleisthenes had begun. It made the ordinary citizen body genuinely sovereign in a way that even Cleisthenes' system had not fully achieved. Ephialtes was assassinated shortly afterward. In circumstances the ancient sources do not adequately explain, Pericles inherited his political position and his project. Over the following 3 decades, he dominated Athenian public life, not through any formal monopoly on power, but through the quality of his judgment on the questions that mattered most, and the accumulated trust of a citizen body that had watched him be right often enough to give him unusual latitude. He was elected strategos, general, 15 consecutive times. He could be voted down. He was. Occasionally, but for roughly 30 years, no one shaped Athenian policy more consistently or more decisively. The building program that produced the Parthenon and the Propylaea and the Erechtheion was the central public project of his leadership. It was also one of his most politically controversial decisions. And the controversy reveals a moral complexity about the Golden Age that the celebratory version of Athenian history consistently underemphasizes. The money that paid for the Parthenon came, in substantial part, from the treasury of the Delian League. The Delian League had been formed in 478 BCE as a voluntary alliance of Greek states to continue the war against Persia and protect the Greek cities of Asia Minor from retaliation. Athens, as the dominant naval power, led the alliance. Member states contributed ships or money to the common fund. Over time, most found it more convenient to contribute money, which meant Athens built and crewed the ships while the allies provided cash. The treasury was moved from the island of Delos to Athens in 454 BCE, a decision that gave Athens practical control of funds contributed for a common military purpose. Pericles used those funds to build the Parthenon. A complaint preserved in Plutarch's biography of Pericles, drawing on earlier sources, describes the Allied reaction directly. Greece was being dishonored, they said. She saw the tribute she had contributed to the war being used by Athens to gild itself with gold, to adorn it like a vain woman draping herself in expensive jewelry, at other people's expense. Pericles' response, as Plutarch records it, was candid and arrogant simultaneously. Athens was fulfilling its military obligations. The allies were getting the protection they had paid for. What Athens did with the surplus was Athens's business. The city that bore the burden of leadership was entitled to the material rewards that leadership produced. This argument will sound familiar to anyone who has studied the rhetoric of hegemonic powers across subsequent history. It should. Athens, in the mid-5th century BCE, was an empire, not in the sense of a single ruler dominating subject peoples by personal force alone, though force was available and used when necessary. An empire in the sense of a hegemonic power extracting resources from formerly allied or subject communities while providing security as the justification. The historian Donald Kagan, in his 4-volume study of the Peloponnesian War, published between 1969 and 1987, describes the relationship between Athenian democracy at home and Athenian empire abroad as structurally intertwined in ways that made the Golden Age possible and made it ultimately unsustainable. The tribute from the empire paid for the fleet. The fleet maintained the empire. The empire paid for the building program and the festivals and the payment for jury service that made democratic participation practically possible for poor citizens. Take away the empire and the democracy of the mid-5th century BCE. In the specific form it took, could not have sustained itself financially. The connection between democratic inclusion at home and imperial extraction abroad is the central moral fact about the Athenian Golden Age that honest history cannot soften. The leisure that allowed Athenian citizens to spend days in the assembly was financed partly by the labor of enslaved people and partly by the tribute of allies who had no vote in the assembly deciding how their money was spent. Both things were true. The extraordinary cultural achievement of the Periclean age was real, and the exploitation that made it financially possible was real. The history that chooses one and ignores the other is not the complete history. Within those qualifications, and they are not minor qualifications, the cultural achievement was extraordinary in ways that are not simply reducible to the resources that enabled it. The tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were writing and producing their plays for the Athenian public during this period. Greek tragedy was not elite entertainment in the modern sense. The great dramatic festivals, particularly the city Dionysia, were civic, religious events attended by the entire citizen body, with funds provided from public resources to pay for attendance by citizens who could not afford it. Ancient sources suggest somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 people watched the tragedies performed in any given festival year. These were not gentle entertainments. Sophocles put a man on stage who discovers that his most consequential choices were made for him before he was old enough to understand what choices meant. Euripides put a woman on stage who kills her own children to punish a man who used and then discarded her. Aeschylus staged the trial of a man who murdered his own mother in obedience to a direct divine command, and then watched the gods themselves disagree about whether the killing was just. A culture that puts its deepest contradictions in front of a civic audience of 20,000 people and refuses to resolve them neatly is a culture with a specific kind of political maturity. The democracy that built the Parthenon also built theaters where that democracy's own worst impulses and deepest hypocrisies were dramatized for the people who participated in that democracy. The connection was not coincidental. In the same streets where the tragedies were discussed, a man was doing something that ancient accounts suggest the Athenian establishment found, over time, considerably more threatening than any play. Socrates was not a professor. He had no school, no institutional position, no written work, no fee structure. What he did every day in the agora and the gymnasiums and the workshops in the harbor district was ask questions. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? Do you actually know what you mean when you use that word? Or do you believe you know? And when the person being questioned tried to answer, he asked another question that revealed the answer was less solid than the speaker had believed. He did this to generals who claimed expertise in courage, to politicians who claimed expertise in justice, to craftsmen who were genuinely skilled in their work and had drawn from that skill the false conclusion that they were therefore wise in general. The historian I.F. Stone, in his study of the trial of Socrates, published in 1988, argues that Socratic questioning had a specific political charge in democratic Athens that it would not have had in a less participatory society. In a democracy, claims about what justice required and what the city needed were everybody's business. A man who spent his days demonstrating that everyone's understanding of those claims was shallower than they believed was doing something that a democracy could find threatening in a way that a monarchy might simply ignore. Thucydides was watching a different kind of drama. He was watching the war that was coming and writing about it with a structural sophistication that remains remarkable. He identified what he called the truest cause of the Peloponnesian War, the growth of Athenian power and the fear it inspired in Sparta, a structural explanation for international conflict that anticipates modern political science by 2,500 years. All of this was happening simultaneously in a city of perhaps 40,000 male citizens, in a territory slightly smaller than the state of Connecticut. The historian H.D.F. Kitto, in his study of the Greeks, published in 1951 and still widely read, describes 5th century BCE Athens as a community in which political participation, artistic production, and philosophical inquiry were aspects of the same civic life rather than separate domains. Citizens who voted in the assembly also attended the tragedies. Men who served on juries also listened to Socrates in the agora. The democracy and the culture were not parallel developments that happened to coexist. They were expressions of the same intense, argument-driven, publicly engaged way of being a community. But the same specific arrangement that was producing this extraordinary flowering was simultaneously producing the conditions for its own destruction. Pericles understood this. He had a strategy to manage it. Avoid a land war with Sparta. Maintain naval dominance. Use the empire's resources to outlast any challenge. Refuse the aggressive overreach that would unite Greece against Athens. The strategy required patience. And patience, as it turned out, was the one quality that the Athenian Democratic Assembly, brilliant and creative and courageous as it was, found most consistently difficult to sustain when the arguments for action were compelling and the speakers making those arguments were skilled. In 431 BCE, the war began. Within a year, a plague arrived that killed Pericles himself and somewhere between a quarter and a third of Athens's population, destroying the strategic patience that had been the entire foundation of his approach. What came after was a democracy making decisions in real time, under real pressure, with the specific capabilities and the specific vulnerabilities that democracy in the ancient world had developed. It was brilliant and catastrophic in roughly equal measure. The Golden Age was ending, and how it ended is the most important part of the story. Chapter 8. The Peloponnesian War. The Suicide of Greece. In the second year of the war, death came to Athens, not from Sparta, but from the water. A ship arrived at the port of Piraeus in the summer of 430 BCE carrying, alongside its cargo, something invisible. Within days, it was moving through the city. Within weeks, it had become the thing that Pericles' strategy had never prepared for. An enemy that could not be outmaneuvered, that did not respond to walls or fleets or financial reserves, that killed generals and common soldiers and priests and philosophers with the same absolute indifference. The plague. Thucydides survived it and described its symptoms with the clinical precision of a man who understood he was recording something history needed to know exactly. The onset was sudden. Violent inflammation in the head, the eyes, the throat, then sneezing, then a chest pain and coughing so severe it seemed to tear the body from the inside, then vomiting. Then the skin erupted in blisters and ulcers that drove some patients to throw themselves into wells in their desperation for any relief from the burning. Most died within 7 to 9 days. Those who survived sometimes lost fingers or toes to gangrene, or their eyesight, or in some cases their memory of who they had been. Doctors died in disproportionate numbers because their exposure was concentrated. Religious rituals lost their meaning as temples filled with the dying and the dead. And the gods, who were supposed to provide protection, provided none. Social bonds dissolved as people understood that caring for the sick meant likely dying themselves. Thucydides describes a moral collapse in which people who believed they were dying anyway abandoned every restraint of law and custom, because the future had ceased to exist as a practical consideration for planning how to behave. The historian Robin Seeley estimates the plague killed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of Athens's total population across its recurrences through the 420s BCE. Pericles himself died in 429 BCE, almost certainly from its effects. Now understand what the death of Pericles actually meant. Pericles had not ruled Athens as a tyrant. He had governed it as a democratic politician, through persuasion, through the accumulated trust of a citizen body that had watched him be right about enough important things to give him unusual latitude. Most importantly, he had been capable of doing the hardest thing a democratic leader ever has to do. He had stood before the assembly and told them things they did not want to hear, and made them accept his argument through the quality of what he said rather than the force behind him. Without him, the Athenian assembly was roughly 40,000 male citizens with votes, a war that was not going the way anyone had imagined, and several loud politicians competing for influence by telling those citizens what they most wanted to hear. Thucydides' portrait of Athenian democratic politics after Pericles is one of the most penetrating analyses of democratic dysfunction ever committed to writing. He describes a succession of leaders who competed for popular support by promising more than they could deliver, by attacking rivals rather than developing coherent strategy, by appealing to the assembly's hunger for action and glory rather than its capacity for patient calculation. The word he uses, demagogus, simply means leader of the people in its Greek original. In Thucydides' hands, watching what happened after 429 BCE, it accumulates a contempt that was not originally embedded in the word. The most consequential of these figures was Cleon, a leather merchant, a detail that ancient sources note with aristocratic disdain that is impossible to separate entirely from the content of the criticism. Cleon was not stupid. He demonstrated genuine political and military capability, but he embodied a style of democratic politics that Thucydides found genuinely alarming. A style where the assembly's worst impulses were cultivated rather than constrained. The Mytilene debate of 427 BCE is the episode Thucydides uses to demonstrate this most precisely. And it deserves full attention because it shows Athenian democracy simultaneously, at its most brutal and its most capable of self-correction. Mytilene was a city on the island of Lesbos that had been among Athens's most privileged allies, governing itself with unusual autonomy within the empire. In 428 BCE, it revolted. The revolt failed. The Athenian fleet arrived. The city surrendered, and the assembly in Athens had to decide what to do. Cleon argued for executing all adult male citizens of Mytilene and enslaving the women and children. His argument was not purely emotional or vindictive. It was strategic. Athens maintained its empire through fear as much as through loyalty. A revolt that cost the rebels nothing would encourage further revolts. The assembly voted to accept his proposal. A trireme was dispatched to Mytilene, carrying the order. The next day, the assembly reconvened. Something had happened overnight. Thucydides describes a widespread feeling that the previous day's decision was cruel and excessive. A collective unease spreading through a city that had slept on what it had voted for and found itself disturbed by it. Cleon returned to defend his position. A politician named Herodotus argued against it, not primarily on moral grounds, but on strategic ones. Mass execution would make future revolts fight to the last man because there would be nothing left to lose by resistance. It would make Athens's military task permanently harder, not easier. The assembly voted to reverse the decision. A second trireme was dispatched to catch the first. The crews ate and slept in shifts, rowing through the night. They arrived in time. The massacre was prevented. What this episode demonstrates is a democracy capable of reconsidering its worst impulse when the argument was made clearly enough and forcefully enough. It also demonstrates a democracy that had the impulse in the first place, that could be moved by a skilled speaker to vote for mass killing one afternoon and regret it before the following morning. Both capabilities were real. Both would matter repeatedly in the years that followed. The war's character shifted in 421 BCE when the Peace of Nicias formally ended the first phase of fighting. Both sides were exhausted. The peace was fragile, built on unfulfilled obligations and suspicions that neither side had actually resolved. But it created a breathing space. Athens still had its empire, its fleet, its financial reserves. With careful management, it might recover its strategic position. Then came the proposal that changed everything. In 415 BCE, a Sicilian city called Segesta appealed to Athens for help against a rival allied with Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in Sicily. The appeal gave a faction in Athens the opening it needed to revive a project that had been discussed and postponed for years: an expedition to conquer Sicily. Sicily was the largest island in the Mediterranean. Syracuse alone was as large and as wealthy as any city in the Greek world. Conquering it would have given Athens resources that could have changed the balance of the entire war. The argument was not irrational. What it required was accurate intelligence about Sicilian defenses, a realistic assessment of the difficulty of besieging a major city across 600 miles of open water, and a unified command that could make decisions quickly under pressure. Athens, in 415 BCE, had none of these in adequate supply. The most passionate advocate for the expedition was Alcibiades, and his story is among the most extraordinary in the ancient world. He was brilliant, physically striking, reckless, charismatic, and, by the consistent testimony of ancient sources, constitutionally incapable of acting in any interest other than his own. He was a ward of Pericles in childhood, which gave him intellectual formation of genuine quality. He was a student and companion of Socrates, which gave him exposure to the most rigorous questioning of his era. He converted both inheritances into instruments of personal advancement with a consistency that left everyone who trusted him eventually betrayed. He wanted to command the Sicilian expedition. He argued for it before the assembly with a force and a vision that Thucydides records with undisguised admiration for the rhetorical quality and undisguised alarm at the strategic substance. The assembly voted to send the expedition. It voted to send it under joint command of Alcibiades, Nicias, who had argued against it, and a general named Lamachus. The expedition that sailed from Athens in the summer of 415 BCE was the largest military force Athens had ever assembled. 134 triremes, over 5,000 heavy infantry, thousands of additional support personnel. Thucydides describes the departure as the most expensive and impressive military expedition a single Greek city had ever launched. And the Athenian people watching the fleet row out of the harbor as having the strange feeling that what they were watching had already become larger than reality, had already entered the realm of legend before it had done anything at all. They were right to feel that strangeness, but not in the way they imagined. Before the fleet reached Sicily, Alcibiades was recalled to Athens to face charges connected to the vandalism of the Hermae, sacred statues of Hermes that had been damaged across the city on the night before the fleet's departure. Whether Alcibiades was responsible for the vandalism cannot be established from available evidence, and ancient sources give conflicting accounts of the incident and its perpetrators. What is certain is that Alcibiades understood Athenian legal proceedings well enough to know what the outcome would be for him. He defected to Sparta. In Sparta, he gave advice that proved devastatingly precise. He told them to send a general to Syracuse. He told them to fortify a position in Attica that would allow Spartan forces to remain in Athenian territory year-round rather than withdrawing each summer as they had done. He told them, from the inside knowledge of someone who had grown up at the center of Athenian strategic planning, exactly where Athens was most vulnerable, the expedition to Sicily. Deprived of its most dynamic commander and opposed by a Spartan general named Gylippus, who arrived in Syracuse with just enough reinforcement to stiffen the city's resistance at the critical moment, ground slowly into catastrophe. The siege that should have been completed quickly dragged on through the winter of 414 into 413. Athens sent reinforcements, doubling the committed force. The reinforcements made the disaster larger rather than preventing it. In the harbor of Syracuse, in August and September of 413 BCE, the Athenian fleet was destroyed in a series of engagements that left it unable to break out. The army attempted to retreat overland across unfamiliar terrain. It was surrounded, harassed, cut apart. The generals surrendered. The entire Athenian force, tens of thousands of men, was put to work in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where thousands died from exposure, disease, and overwork over the following months. Thucydides ends his account of the Sicilian disaster with a sentence that has no dramatic embellishment because it does not require any. He writes that the victors had achieved the greatest success and the vanquished the worst of all defeats, for they were utterly destroyed, as the saying goes, with their ships and their men, and nothing was saved. Athens should have collapsed. By any rational calculation, a city that had just lost its largest military expedition, that now faced a Sparta reinvigorated by insider intelligence, that had rebellions spreading across its empire as subject states sensed weakness, should have been finished. It was not finished, The resilience Athens displayed in the years after Sicily is one of the most remarkable things in its entire history. The city built new ships, raised new revenues, and managed internal political crises, including an oligarchic coup in 411 BCE that briefly overthrew the democracy before being reversed by the fleet. The coup deserves attention because it shows the other face of what the Sicilian disaster had done to Athenian political culture. A group of wealthy oligarchs, using the argument that extreme crisis required the suspension of normal democratic procedures, established a council of 400 as a replacement for the assembly. They did not hold power long. The Athenian fleet at Samos, which had not accepted the coup, constituted itself as the legitimate democratic government and threatened to sail back to Athens and remove the oligarchs by force. The 400 collapsed. Democracy was restored. What the coup episode demonstrates is that Athenian democracy had serious enemies within Athens itself. Capable men who had always believed democracy was a mistake and who had waited for a crisis severe enough to make their view politically viable. The democracy survived because the fleet, the institution that gave the poorest citizens their military function and their political standing, refused to accept the abolition of the system that had created them. The democracy defended itself because the people who benefited from it understood what they were defending. The final decade of the war was decided not by Athenian or Spartan military superiority, but by Persian money. Persia had watched Athens and Sparta exhaust each other for 20 years, which was rational from the Persian perspective. When Sparta sought financial support to build a fleet capable of challenging Athenian naval dominance, Persia provided subsidies in exchange for Spartan endorsement of Persian claims over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. The same cities whose freedom from Persia had been the original justification for the Delian League. The same alliance whose treasury had paid for the Parthenon. The irony was visible to everyone at the time. It changed nothing. The final Athenian defeat came at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. The Athenian fleet was caught on shore, unprepared, by the Spartan admiral Lysander. Most of it was captured or destroyed. Athens was blockaded by land and sea. In 404 BCE, Athens surrendered. The terms Sparta imposed were deliberate in their symbolism. The long walls connecting Athens to its port, the walls that had made Pericles' strategy possible and that had stood for decades as the physical expression of Athenian resilience, were torn down. Ancient sources record that the Spartans played flutes as they worked. Whether this detail is precisely accurate or accumulated around the event over time cannot be confirmed, but it captures something true about what Sparta intended to communicate. This was not merely a military settlement. It was a message about what Athens had been and what it was now. A pro-Spartan oligarchy of 30 men was installed with Spartan backing. They became known in Athenian historical memory as the 30 Tyrants, and the name was earned. In 8 months, they executed approximately 1,500 people and drove thousands more into exile. According to figures that appear in ancient sources, including later speeches by Athenian orators, though the precise count cannot be independently verified from this distance, their targets were democratic politicians and anyone wealthy enough to make confiscation worthwhile. People were afraid to speak, afraid to be seen together, afraid that any conversation might be overheard and reported. The democracy was restored in 403 BCE when a group of exiles, led by Thrasybulus, returned from the border town of Phyle, gathered support, and marched on Athens. The Spartan king Pausanias came not to restore the oligarchs, but to negotiate a settlement, reflecting internal Spartan politics as much as any concern for Athenian affairs. The democracy was restored under terms of general amnesty. Athens rebuilt. It recovered commercial prosperity. It produced in the 4th century BCE the philosophical work of Plato and Aristotle that would shape Western thought more comprehensively than anything the Golden Age had created. But the Athenian Empire was gone. The specific version of democratic expansionism that Pericles had built was over, and in 399 BCE, 4 years after the democracy's restoration, the city made a decision that would define its legacy more completely than any battle had. A jury of 501 Athenian citizens voted on whether Socrates should live or die. He was charged with impiety and with corrupting the youth of Athens. He was found guilty by a majority. He was offered the chance to propose an alternative penalty to death, he suggested, with the serene clarity that had characterized everything he did. Free meals at public expense for the rest of his life. The honor reserved for Olympic victors and great public benefactors. The jury chose death. Socrates drank the hemlock in 399 BCE. The democracy that executed him was the same democracy that had built the Parthenon and defeated Persia and filled the theaters with audiences watching Sophocles. Not a corrupted replacement, not a different institution that had somehow taken over a better one. The same democracy, making a different kind of decision in different conditions, showing the same capacity for both extraordinary achievement and catastrophic moral failure that had characterized it from its beginning. The Peloponnesian War did not destroy Greece. It destroyed a specific version of Greek political possibility. The vision of Athenian democratic leadership over a unified Greek world that Pericles had built and that the democratic assembly had progressively undermined through the specific failures of impatience, overconfidence, and susceptibility to brilliant arguments in service of catastrophic ideas. What came after was not recovery in the sense of returning to what had been. The Greek world had been reshaped by 27 years of war that exposed every limitation of the city-state system. And somewhere to the north, in a kingdom that most Greek city-states regarded with contempt, a man was watching all of it very carefully. He had been watching for a long time, and he had been learning. Chapter 9. The 4th Century. Collapse, Recovery, and Philip's Shadow. In the spring of 399 BCE, the day after Socrates drank the hemlock, his student Plato was approximately 28 years old. He had grown up watching the Peloponnesian War's final phase. He had watched the democracy overthrown by the 30 tyrants and then restored. He had watched the restored democracy put Socrates, the man he considered the wisest person he had ever encountered, to death by democratic vote. Plato left Athens. He traveled for years to Megara, to Egypt, to southern Italy, to Sicily. He was not simply processing grief. He was working on a problem. The problem was this: the best political system the world had yet produced. The Athenian democracy had been capable of the Parthenon and the naval victory at Salamis and the literary culture that produced Sophocles. It had also been capable of the Sicilian disaster, the execution of generals after victory at Arginusae, and the death of Socrates. What explained the combination? And was there a form of governance that could capture what was good in democracy while protecting against what was catastrophic in it? When Plato eventually returned to Athens and founded the Academy around 387 BCE, that question was the central project of his intellectual life. His Republic, the most influential political philosophy text in Western history, is not primarily a blueprint for authoritarianism, though it has been read that way. It is primarily an answer to the question that watching Athens had forced on him. Why do free societies make catastrophically bad decisions? And what would a society designed to make consistently good decisions actually require? His answer: a community governed by those with genuine knowledge of the good, rather than by the preferences of the majority, has been attacked as anti-democratic ever since it was written. It has also been engaged with by every serious political philosopher in the Western tradition, because Plato identified a genuine tension in democratic theory that has not been resolved. The tension between the idea that legitimate authority derives from the consent of the governed and the uncomfortable possibility that the governed can consent to things that are genuinely catastrophic. The Greek world of the 4th century BCE was producing this kind of philosophical depth precisely because it had experienced the kind of political catastrophe that forces fundamental questions. The Peloponnesian War had been the education. The Republic was part of the result. But while philosophers were working on the deep questions, the practical political situation was deteriorating in ways that philosophy could not address. The immediate aftermath of the war was defined by the failure of Spartan hegemony. Sparta had won, but Sparta's victory had been purchased with Persian money, and the price was Spartan endorsement of Persian control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. The same Sparta that had justified the Peloponnesian War partly by accusing Athens of enslaving Greek allies was now handing Greek cities to Persia as diplomatic currency. This contradiction was not invisible to the Greek world. It damaged Spartan moral authority in ways that military dominance could not repair. Spartan hegemony also simply failed at the practical work of governing a Greek world it had never been designed to manage. Sparta had spent 3 centuries building institutions optimized for one specific purpose: governing a network of independent city-states, each with its own political culture and its own sense of dignity, required completely different institutional capacities. Sparta approached it with garrison forces and puppet governments that generated resentment far more reliably than compliance. The challenge to Spartan dominance came from a direction the war would not have predicted. Thebes, in the region of Boeotia, north of Athens, had collaborated with Persia during the Persian Wars and allied with Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. It was not, by any conventional assessment, the city most likely to reshape Greek military history. Then it produced 2 men. Pelopidas and Epaminondas were friends, complementary in their qualities in ways that made their partnership greater than either would have been alone. Pelopidas was the aggressive, personally courageous fighter who led from the front and inspired men by example. Epaminondas was the strategic thinker who understood that Greek battlefield tactics had been operating within the same conventional assumptions for a century, and that those assumptions, treated as laws of nature by every army that followed them, were actually choices that could be unmade. The specific choice Epaminondas identified was this: Greek battle lines always placed the best troops on the right wing, and battles were typically decided by which side's right wing broke the other's left. Both sides knew this. Both sides did it. It had become as ritualized as a dance. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Epaminondas massed his best troops, including the Sacred Band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of male companions organized on the theory that men would not show cowardice before the people they loved. On his left wing, at unprecedented depth, 50 ranks rather than the standard 8 or 12, he placed this crushing weight directly opposite the Spartan right wing, where the best Spartan fighters were positioned by convention, and weakened his own right deliberately to hold the Spartans there, while his left obliterated theirs. Approximately 400 Spartan citizens died at Leuctra. The number sounds manageable until you understand the demographic reality. the full Spartiate citizen body. The men who had completed the agoge and maintained their mess membership and bore the full burden and privilege of Spartan citizenship had been declining for generations, from several thousand to perhaps 1,000 or fewer by the time of Leuctra. Through the attrition of decades of warfare and the demographic pressures of a system extraordinarily demanding on those inside it, 400 dead in a single afternoon was not a military setback. It was a catastrophe from which the specific social system that had produced Spartan power could not recover. Epaminondas followed Leuctra by marching into the Peloponnese, something no enemy army had done in living memory. He liberated the Messenian Helots, the enslaved population whose agricultural labor had underpinned Spartan civilization for 3 centuries, and helped them found a new city called Messene on the slopes of Mount Ithome. In a single campaign, the economic and security foundation of the Spartan system was removed. Sparta did not cease to exist. It continued as a regional military power, but the myth of Spartan invincibility was gone. And without the Helots, the specific social system that had produced Spartan military excellence could not be reproduced. Theban hegemony lasted approximately a decade, held together almost entirely by the personal qualities of Epaminondas. When he died at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, winning the engagement but killed in the fighting, Theban dominance ended within the year. Thebes had not built the institutional foundations that could sustain hegemony after the extraordinary individual who had created it was gone. The historian John Barry and Russell Meggs, in their foundational history of Greece, described the period after Mantinea as a moment of collective exhaustion and deadlock, in which Athens, Sparta, and Thebes had each demonstrated that none of them could permanently dominate the others, and all of them had been substantially weakened by the attempt. The Greek city-state system had produced 3 hegemonic powers in succession within a century, and each had followed the same arc: rise, overextension, the coalition of the resentful, and decline. The structural problem the city-states faced was one that none of them could solve from within the system, because the system itself was the problem. The city-state defined itself by its autonomy, its right to make its own laws and conduct its own foreign policy. Any arrangement that required genuine subordination of those functions to a higher authority ran directly against the deepest commitments of the political culture that had produced everything worth preserving about the Greek world. The Greeks had developed, through 3 centuries of hard experience, a sophisticated understanding of why concentrated power was dangerous. What they had not developed, and could not develop within the logic of the polis, was an equally sophisticated understanding of when power needed to be pooled. Athens attempted a response. The Second Athenian Confederacy, formed in 378 BCE, was explicitly designed to avoid the mistakes of the Delian League. No Athenian garrisons in allied territory, no tribute, an allied council with genuine independent voting rights. The design reflected real learning from the First Empire's failures. It broke down anyway. The same pressures that had corrupted the Delian League operated on the Second Confederacy with the same results. By the 350s, Athens was suppressing revolts within its own confederacy. By the 340s, the Confederacy was effectively over. The ceiling was real. The city-state system had hit it from every direction. While Athens and Sparta and Thebes were demonstrating the ceiling from inside it, the solution was being prepared from outside. And the man preparing it had been watching the Greek cities fail for years, taking notes, and building something that none of them had been able to build. Philip II became king of Macedonia in 359 BCE at age 23. in circumstances of serious dynastic crisis. The kingdom had just suffered a military defeat. Multiple rivals were competing for the throne. Within 3 years, he had defeated all of them and reorganized the Macedonian army into one of the most effective military instruments the ancient world had yet seen. The core of his innovation was the sarissa, a Macedonian pike approximately 5 to 7 meters long, roughly twice the length of a conventional Greek spear. A phalanx of infantry, each carrying a sarissa, presented a front of overlapping spear points extending several meters beyond the front rank, creating a wall of iron that conventional hoplite formations could not approach closely enough to engage effectively. The phalanx held the enemy in place. Philip's companion cavalry, heavy horse on the wings, exploited the gaps created by the phalanx's pressure to deliver decisive strikes against flanks and rear. But Philip understood something that purely military thinking consistently underestimates. The best army wins the battles it has to fight. The best strategist reduces the number of battles required. His approach to Greek affairs combined military pressure with diplomatic sophistication in ways that accumulated influence and obligation without triggering the unified resistance that a direct military challenge would have provoked. He used growing power to intervene in Greek interstate disputes in ways that made him useful to different factions simultaneously. He presented himself as a protector to communities that feared their neighbors and as an arbiter to those seeking external support. He made himself difficult to oppose cleanly because his intentions were always deniable until they were not. The Athenian orator Demosthenes understood what Philip was doing more clearly than almost anyone else in Greece. His speeches against Philip, known as the Philippics, survive and remain among the most technically accomplished pieces of political rhetoric in the ancient record. Demosthenes was not simply warning about a military threat. He was arguing that Philip represented something qualitatively different from any previous Greek political force. A unified monarchical power that could direct its resources with a strategic coherence and a long-term patience that no democratic assembly could match. Because no democratic assembly had to answer only to itself. His analysis was essentially correct. His proposed solution, Athenian leadership of a genuinely unified Greek resistance, was politically unrealistic. Too many Greek states had too recent memories of what Athenian leadership actually meant from the inside to submit to it voluntarily again. The crisis came in 338 BCE. Philip moved south. Athens and Thebes formed a coalition to stop him. At the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip commanded the Macedonian right, and his 18-year-old son Alexander commanded the companion cavalry on the left. The coalition was defeated decisively. The sacred band of Thebes died where they stood. They did not break. They did not run. They were killed in formation, fighting at the place where they had chosen to make their stand. Ancienne tradition, preserved in Plutarch writing centuries after the event, describes Philip weeping when he walked across the battlefield and found them. He said, according to this tradition, that men who would die rather than yield deserved something better than an enemy's contempt. Whether that exchange happened in precisely those words cannot be confirmed from available evidence. What it captures accurately is something real about how the Greeks themselves understood what had ended at Chaeronea. After Chaeronea, Philip organized the Greek city-states into the League of Corinth under Macedonian leadership. The cities retained their internal autonomy. Their assemblies still met. Their courts still functioned. But their foreign policy was now subject to Macedonian direction. The age of the fully independent polis as the primary unit of Greek political life was over. Philip was assassinated in 336 BCE at his daughter's wedding. The ancient sources give several explanations, none of them entirely convincing, which usually indicates that the truth involved political motivations that surviving sources had reasons not to record plainly. He left behind a kingdom, an army, and a plan to reverse the direction of the Persian Wars entirely, to take the war from defensive to offensive, to march east rather than waiting for the east to come west. He left behind a son who had watched everything and learned from all of it and had been waiting, with the particular impatience of the extraordinarily talented and the very young, for the moment when the plan would be his to execute. Alexander was 20 years old. The Greek cities that had not yet fully understood the cost of resistance received their lesson quickly. Thebes rose against Macedonian authority and was destroyed so thoroughly that only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were left standing. 6,000 people were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The message reached every city that was still calculating its options. The gate to the east was open, and what walked through it was about to run out of world. Chapter 10. Alexander the Great, the man who ran out of world. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont from Europe into Asia with approximately 40,000 men. Before he stepped ashore, he did something that ancient sources, including Arrian, who drew on accounts closer to the events than any other ancient writer we have, describe with careful attention. He threw a spear from the bow of his ship into the Asian soil before stepping ashore in full armor. The gesture was deliberate. Asia claimed by the spear. He was also, by the testimony of ancient sources. Thinking about Achilles, his first act after landing was to visit the tomb at Troy, where he ran a foot race around the burial mound and made offerings to the hero he had been taught since childhood to consider his ancestor and his model. He was 22 years old. He would never return. The scale of what happened between that spring crossing and his death in Babylon in 323 BCE sits at the outer limit of what the historical record suggests human beings are capable of. He conquered the Persian Empire, the entire Persian Empire, the political entity that had ruled the largest territory in the ancient world for 2 centuries. In a series of engagements over 11 years, he then kept going east, into territories the Persians had never fully controlled, until his army refused to continue. To understand Alexander, you have to start with his relationship with his father, because that relationship shaped everything that followed. Philip was a genius by any practical measure. He had built Macedonia from a weak kingdom facing dynastic crisis to the dominant power in the Greek world in roughly 20 years. He was also a man who drank heavily, kept multiple wives, and directed at his gifted son the particular combination of pride and competitive pressure that powerful fathers sometimes aim at talented sons who show signs of matching or surpassing them. When Philip married a new Macedonian wife in 337 BCE, her uncle toasted the prospect of a legitimate heir at the wedding banquet, the implication being that Alexander, whose mother Olympias was an Epirot princess rather than a Macedonian noblewoman, had a complicated claim. Alexander threw his cup at the man. Philip drew his sword and fell over drunk before reaching his son. Alexander left Macedonia with his mother. The reconciliation that followed was incomplete. When Philip was assassinated a year later, Alexander moved with a speed and decisiveness in securing the throne and eliminating rival claimants that indicates he had thought carefully about the scenario before it occurred. Whether he had any role in what happened is something the ancient sources raise without resolving, and modern historians have not reached consensus on the question from his tutor Aristotle, who educated him from age 13 to 16 at a school established specifically for the purpose. Alexander, inherited an intellectual formation that expressed itself throughout his campaigns in ways that go beyond what a purely military commander would have needed. He took scientists, historians, geographers, and botanists with him into Asia to record what they found. He asked questions about the peoples he encountered and their customs and their religious practices that reflect genuine curiosity. The historian Robin Lane Fox, in his detailed biography published in 1973, argues that Alexander's intellectual interests were real and that they shaped his approach to conquest in ways that distinguished him from commanders who regarded conquered territory purely as a resource to extract. The Persian campaign opened at the Granicus River in 334 BCE, where Alexander led a cavalry charge across a fast-flowing river against a Persian force positioned on the opposite bank. Against the advice of his senior general Parmenion, who counseled waiting and crossing at a safer point under cover of darkness, Alexander crossed immediately. He nearly died in the fighting, saved by his commander Cleitus the Black, who killed a Persian nobleman about to bring a sword down on Alexander's exposed head from behind. The willingness to fight from the most dangerous position was not simply recklessness. An army campaigning thousands of miles from home, in conditions of increasing hardship and strangeness, follows its commander, partly because it has watched him do things it knows are extraordinarily dangerous and has watched him survive. The personal courage was genuine, and it was also a strategic instrument. At Issus, in 333 BCE, Alexander faced Darius III directly for the first time. Darius commanded a force substantially larger than Alexander's. Positioned in a coastal plain he expected would give his numerical advantage room to operate. Alexander identified the gap between the Persian left wing and the sea as the critical vulnerability. He directed his cavalry charge at that point, broke through, and wheeled inward toward the Persian center. Darius fled in his chariot before his own line had fully collapsed. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters were captured in his abandoned camp. Ancienne tradition, preserved in sources including Plutarch, writing centuries after the events, describes Alexander visiting them the following morning with his companion Hephaestion, who was taller than Alexander. Darius's mother prostrated herself before Hephaestion, mistaking him for the king. When she realized her error, she was mortified. Alexander reportedly told her she had made no mistake, that Hephaestion was also Alexander. Whether this exchange happened in precisely these words cannot be confirmed from available evidence written this much later. What it accurately reflects is Alexander's actual policy toward the Persian royal family, treating them as royalty under his protection rather than prisoners to be humiliated. A policy consistent with his broader intention not to destroy Persian civilization, but to rule it. He retained Persian administrative systems largely intact. He kept Persian governors in many provinces. He adopted Persian court dress and ceremonial practices in ways that deeply disturbed his Macedonian officers, who saw it as a betrayal of the Greek identity the entire campaign was supposedly advancing. The siege of Tyre in 332 BCE was the most extraordinary single engineering achievement of the campaign. Tyre was an island city half a mile offshore, protected by walls 30 meters high and defended by a fleet. It had resisted Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon for 13 years. Alexander built a causeway from the mainland to the island, half a mile of stone and timber constructed under continuous fire from the city's defenders. The causeway is still there. The island of Tyre is now a peninsula because Alexander connected it to the mainland more than 2,300 years ago. Egypt welcomed him with minimal resistance. He founded Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, visiting the oracle of the god Amun at the Siwa oasis in a journey of several hundred miles through desert terrain. What the oracle told him was never publicly revealed. He emerged, referring to Amun as his father, a claim he maintained for the rest of his life. The decisive engagement of the Persian campaign came at Gamela in 331 BCE. Darius had chosen flat terrain carefully, leveling the ground and deploying scythed chariots designed to break the phalanx. He commanded a force that modern estimates place at somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 men against Alexander's approximately 47,000. Under pressure on the left wing, Parmenion sent a message asking for help. Alexander sent back word that a commander who was winning did not need help, and one who was losing was too far away to reach. He had identified the gap in the Persian line and was driving toward it. He reached it before Parmenion's wing broke. Darius fled. The Persian army disintegrated. Alexander pursued Darius east across the Iranian plateau. The Persian king was murdered by his own satrap Bessus before Alexander could reach him. Alexander gave Darius a royal funeral and declared himself the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid dynasty. He hunted Bessus down and had him executed. Framing this publicly as justice for regicide, he pressed on into the territories we now call Afghanistan and Pakistan and northwestern India. Each conquest generated the pressure toward the next, because there was always another frontier beyond the last one. Always a people who had not submitted. Always territory that the logic of his own momentum seemed to require. The historian Paul Cartledge, in his study of Alexander, published in 2004, describes this forward drive as exceeding rational strategic calculation, driven by something in Alexander's psychology that required the horizon to remain open. The campaign in Bactria and Sogdia, modern Afghanistan, was the hardest fighting of the entire campaign. 3 years of warfare against opponents who avoided pitched battle and excelled at harassment and ambush. Alexander founded cities at strategic points, garrisoning them with Macedonian and Greek settlers. He married Roxanne, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, in 327 BCE. He crossed into India in 327 BCE and defeated the Indian king Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE. Porus was captured. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus answered like a king. Alexander returned his kingdom as a vassal state. Then, on the banks of the Hyphasis River in the summer of 326 BCE, the army stopped. 8 years. They had been marching and fighting for 8 years, across deserts and mountains and rivers, in heat and cold, in terrain no Macedonian army had ever seen. They had been extraordinary. They were done. Alexander spent 3 days in his tent, refusing to speak to anyone, hoping the army would change its mind. It did not change its mind. He emerged and argued his case in assembly. The army listened respectfully and said nothing. His senior commander, Coenus, spoke for everyone. They wanted to go home. They had earned it. Alexander sacrificed to the gods and received omens that crossing the river would be inauspicious. He turned the army around. The return through the Gedrosian desert killed thousands from heat and thirst and exhaustion. Alexander reached Susa in 324 BCE. He organized the mass marriage ceremony at which 80 senior officers and approximately 10,000 Macedonian soldiers married Persian and Iranian women, an attempt to begin fusing the two governing aristocracies into a single class. He had killed his friend Claudius the Black in a drunken argument in 328 BCE and spent days afterward in a grief his companions found alarming. When Hephaestion his closest companion since childhood, died in 324 BCE. The grief was more extreme. He cut his own hair. He had the doctor crucified. He fell ill in Babylon in June of 323 BCE. He was sick for approximately 10 days. He died on the 10th or 11th of June. He was 32 years old. The cause cannot be established with certainty from available evidence. Ancient sources suggest fever. Some modern historians have proposed typhoid fever complicated by heavy alcohol use. Poisoning appears in some ancient accounts, but lacks strong supporting evidence and should be treated as historical speculation rather than established fact. He was asked, as he was dying, to whom he left his empire. To the strongest. He reportedly answered. Some ancient sources give a variant. He said he could already see his funeral games beginning. In either version, the meaning was the same. There was no designated successor. There was no institutional framework that could hold what he had built without him. There was only the question of who among the extraordinary men he had led would prove strong enough to take the largest piece. The answer, as it turned out, was that no single one of them was strong enough to take it all. They would fight over the inheritance for 40 years. And what they would eventually build from the fragments would be something more durable in its parts than the unified empire had been. A world in which Greek language and Greek ideas spread further than any Macedonian army had ever marched. He had run out of world. The world he had made was just beginning. Chapter 11. The Hellenistic World. When Greek ideas went global, in the library at Alexandria, sometime around 240 BCE, a scholar named Eratosthenes of Cyrene read a report that had traveled up the Nile from the city of Syene, roughly 500 miles to the south. The report described something the people of Syene had noticed about the summer solstice. At noon, on the longest day of the year, the sun shone directly down into deep wells, illuminating the water at the bottom without casting any shadow on the sides. A stick placed vertically in the ground cast no shadow at all. Eratosthenes went outside in Alexandria on the same day at the same time and measured the angle of a vertical stick's shadow. The shadow existed. It fell at approximately 7 degrees from vertical. He sat with this difference. If the earth were flat, the sun's rays would strike every vertical surface at the same angle everywhere simultaneously, and there would be no difference between Alexandria and Syene. But if the earth were curved, a difference in latitude would produce exactly the shadow differential he was observing. He knew the approximate distance between Alexandria and Syene from the records of camel caravans that traveled the route regularly. He knew the angle. The geometry required was not complicated. He calculated the circumference of the earth. His result, accounting for the conversion between his ancient unit of measurement and modern equivalents, was within a few % of the value we measure today with satellite technology. A man in Egypt, in the 3rd century BCE, working with a stick in a shadow and a record of camel travel time, calculated the circumference of the planet to within a few % of the correct answer. He did not discover this through revelation or tradition or religious authority. He discovered it by applying mathematical reasoning to careful observation and following the logic wherever it led, regardless of whether the answer was expected. That is what the Hellenistic world at its best was. And it is what makes the period between Alexander's death in 323 BCE and Rome's absorption of the last successor kingdom in 30 BCE so consequential as an intellectual story. Even as the political story is largely one of fragmentation and dynastic violence, the political story first. Briefly, because it provides the context for everything else. When Alexander died leaving no functional succession plan, The Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors, consumed the following 40 years in a sequence of shifting alliances, betrayals, and military campaigns across 3 continents that even the Peloponnesian War had not matched in geographic scale. The eventual outcome was a set of successor kingdoms whose boundaries stabilized around 301 BCE. Ptolemy took Egypt and founded a dynasty that lasted until the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BCE, making it one of the most durable political consequences of Alexander's conquests. Seleucus took the bulk of the Asian territories, Persia and Mesopotamia and Syria, founding the Seleucid Empire that at its peak was the largest of the successors, but would gradually lose its eastern provinces to local resistance and the expanding Parthian state. Antigonus and his descendants eventually consolidated control over Macedonia. Pergamon, in western Asia Minor, became under the Attalid dynasty a significant regional power, with cultural ambitions that produced some of the most spectacular sculpture of the ancient world. These kingdoms fought each other. Their internal politics featured family violence and succession disputes that grew worse as the dynasties aged. None achieved the stability that Alexander had briefly embodied, but they all shared one thing. They all used Greek as the language of administration, commerce, and intellectual life. And in doing so, they created something that had not previously existed in human history: a common medium for the exchange of ideas across a geographic area stretching from the Adriatic to the borders of India. This is the condition that made Alexandria possible. And Alexandria is where the Hellenistic world's intellectual achievement reached its most concentrated expression. The Ptolemaic kings built the Museum, a word derived from the Greek mousion, a place sacred to the Muses, which functioned as a research institution supporting scholars across virtually every field of inquiry. Attached to it was the library, which attempted to collect every significant work written in Greek and eventually in other languages. The scholar Callimachus compiled the Pinakies, a comprehensive catalog of the library's holdings that was itself one of the most ambitious bibliographic projects of antiquity. Euclid wrote his Elements in Alexandria around 300 BCE. The Elements established the axiomatic method, beginning from clearly defined axioms and deriving theorems through logical proof. As the foundation of mathematical reasoning, it was used as the primary textbook for mathematical education in the Western world for over 2,000 years. Every mathematical proof written anywhere in the world today operates within the methodological framework Euclid demonstrated could work. The physician Herodotus conducted systematic anatomical research in Alexandria, including dissections of human cadavers. His descriptions of the brain, the nervous system, and the vascular system were more precise than anything previously recorded and remained foundational to medical education for centuries. Aristarchus of Samos, working in the early 3rd century BCE, proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, arguing that the Earth orbited the Sun rather than vice versa. He worked out a geometric method for estimating the relative distances of the Earth from the Sun and Moon. His heliocentric model was not wrong. It was roughly 17 centuries ahead of Copernicus, who would develop similar arguments in the European Renaissance. Aristarchus's model was known to subsequent ancient scholars. It was considered, evaluated, and largely set aside in favor of the geocentric model that better fit the mathematical tools available for predicting planetary positions and better matched the intuitive experience of observation. The history of science is not a smooth progression from ignorance to knowledge. It is a story of ideas arriving before the tools exist to test them, sometimes waiting centuries until the tools catch up. The philosophical schools the Hellenistic period produced were responses to the specific condition of an educated individual in a world that had become simultaneously larger and more impersonal. The city-state had given citizens a concrete community small enough to feel personally meaningful. The Hellenistic kingdoms were vast. Bureaucratic, governed by rulers, you had no part in choosing and no real ability to influence. Epicurus founded his school in Athens in 306 BCE in a garden outside the city. His philosophy was built around ataraxia, a state of tranquility achieved through moderate pleasures, genuine friendship, and rational understanding of the natural world. The Epicurean gods exist but are entirely indifferent to human affairs. Death is simply the cessation of sensation. The goal was not intense pleasure, but the carefully managed absence of suffering, centered on a small community of friends. It was a philosophy designed for people who had concluded that political ambition and social competition brought more anxiety than satisfaction. Zeno of Citium founded the Stoic school at roughly the same time, teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, from which the school took its name. Stoicism taught that the universe is governed by logos, a rational principle, and that human capacity for reason is a participation in that universal rationality. The Stoic goal is to live according to nature, which means according to reason, which means accepting with equanimity everything outside your control and directing your will only at what is within it. External circumstances, health, wealth, reputation, political success, are not in your control and should not be the foundation of your well-being. Your judgments and responses are in your control, and these are what matter. The appeal of Stoicism in the Hellenistic world requires no elaborate explanation. A philosophy offering rational tools for maintaining inner stability regardless of external circumstances is precisely what an educated person needs when the external circumstances include the dissolution of the political community that once gave life its meaning. The Stoic found freedom in the only place the Hellenistic world reliably offered it: inside. Both schools traveled west with the Greek language and became the dominant philosophical frameworks of the Roman educated class. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, writing his private philosophical journal in the 2nd century CE, wrote entirely in Greek and in the Stoic tradition. When he reflects on the brevity of human life and the importance of acting rightly regardless of recognition or result, he is drawing on a tradition that originated in Athens 3 centuries before his birth. The relationship between Greek newcomers and the existing civilizations of Alexander's conquered territories was not a simple story of cultural replacement. It was a negotiation producing genuine new syntheses. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic kings presented themselves as pharaohs to Egyptian subjects and as Hellenistic monarchs to Greek and Macedonian residents. The god Serapis, created under Ptolemaic patronage, fused elements of Egyptian gods, Osiris and Apis, with aspects of the Greek god Dionysus, producing a deity accessible to both populations. The great temple complexes of the Egyptian tradition continued to receive royal patronage, but were now decorated with reliefs showing Ptolemaic rulers in pharaonic dress making offerings to Egyptian gods. With texts in both hieroglyphic and Greek, the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek in Alexandria during this period. A translation called the Septuagint, which became the version of the Old Testament used by early Christians and remains in use in the Greek Orthodox tradition today. Jewish communities across the Hellenistic world navigated the relationship between their own religious identity and Greek cultural forms in ways that produced thinkers like Philo of Alexandria, who attempted to demonstrate the compatibility of Jewish theology and Greek philosophy, work that would later influence Christian theological development significantly. the Hellenistic world is often treated as a period of decline from the classical peak, a falling off characterized by political fragmentation and cultural dilution. This framing misses what actually happened. The Hellenistic period was a transformation, the specific form of the classical city-state, with its concentrated political intensity and its small civic scale, was gone. What replaced it was something larger, more geographically extended, and in certain respects, intellectually richer. The science done in Hellenistic Alexandria was more sophisticated than anything done in classical Athens. The philosophical frameworks of Epicureanism and Stoicism addressed the actual conditions of human life more practically than Platonic idealism had addressed life in the polis. Greek ideas had been released from the specific container of the Athenian polis and sent into a much larger and more complicated world. They traveled, they adapted, they embedded themselves in new languages and new traditions. The container was about to change again. Rome was waiting, and Rome, whatever its failures and its brutalities, knew how to keep what it had been given. Chapter 12. The Roman Conquest and the End of Greek Independence. In 146 BCE, a Roman general named Lucius Mummius stood outside the walls of Corinth and gave an order. He ordered the city burned, its male population killed, its women and children sold into slavery. Corinth, one of the oldest and wealthiest cities in the Greek world, a city that had been commercially significant for 5 centuries at the crossroads of Mediterranean trade, was reduced to ash in a single afternoon. Mummius then began shipping the contents of Corinth's art collections to Rome. Ancient sources record a detail about this process that has been repeated for 2,000 years because it captures something essential about what Roman conquest of Greece actually meant. As he arranged the transport of paintings and sculptures and bronze works representing centuries of Greek artistic achievement, Mummius reportedly warned the shipping contractors that if any piece was damaged in transit, they would be required to replace it with a work of equivalent quality. Whether this was said in precisely these words, or is a tradition that accumulated around the event over time, it accurately reflects something real about the encounter between Roman power and Greek culture. Rome could destroy Corinth. Rome could not produce what Corinth had produced. And Rome knew it. The Roman conquest of the Greek world unfolded across more than 2 centuries. From Rome's first significant military engagement with a Hellenistic power in 214 BCE to the final absorption of Egypt in 30 BCE, when Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra VII and added the last successor kingdom to Roman dominion. Understanding this process requires understanding both why Rome succeeded and what the success actually meant for the Greek-speaking world that experienced it. Rome, in the late 3rd century BCE, was not obviously the power that should have been able to dominate the Hellenistic kingdoms. It was a city-state that had recently unified the Italian peninsula and had just survived Hannibal of Carthage's 15-year campaign in Italy itself. Its cultural life was substantially indebted to Greek models that Romans acknowledged openly. Roman aristocrats hired Greek tutors. Roman religious practice had absorbed Greek gods under Roman names. The Latin alphabet was derived from a Greek colonial alphabet. Rome was, in significant measure, a Hellenized civilization before it conquered the Hellenistic world. What Rome had that the Hellenistic kingdoms lacked was institutional durability combined with military adaptability. The Roman legionary system organized heavy infantry into smaller and more flexible tactical units than the Macedonian phalanx. Units that could maintain effectiveness on varied terrain where the phalanx was vulnerable. At the Battle of Cynocephaly in 197 BCE, the Roman general Flamininus defeated Philip V of Macedon precisely by exploiting the moment when the Macedonian phalanx formation broke on uneven ground. But the military explanation for Roman success misses something important. Rome managed the politics of Greek interstate relationships with a sophistication that consistently prevented the unified resistance that might have stopped it. After Cynocephalae, Flamininus made an announcement at the Isthmian Games in 196 BCE that produced a reaction ancient sources describe as extraordinary. He declared that Rome was freeing the Greek cities from Macedonian domination and restoring their autonomy. The assembled Greeks, according to Polybius, who was writing within living memory of the events, were so stunned that they initially could not process what they had heard. The herald repeated the announcement. Then the crowd erupted in a sound so overwhelming that Polybius writes, birds fell from the sky, from the shock of it. Whether birds literally fell is a literary flourish. What the passage captures accurately is the psychological weight of hearing from the representative of the most powerful military force in the Mediterranean world, that the Greek cities would be free. Rome was not actually committed to permanent Greek autonomy. The declaration was strategically useful at a specific moment. Over the following decades, as Roman power consolidated and the practical meaning of autonomy within the Roman orbit became clear, the gap between declaration and reality widened. But the initial declaration worked because it corresponded to something real. The successor kingdoms had not been popular rulers. Communities that resented Macedonian dominance were genuinely receptive to a power presenting itself as a liberator, at least until they discovered what Roman protection actually required. Consider what the transition looked like from inside a Greek city experiencing it. Your assembly still meets. Your council still debates. Your magistrates still administer local affairs. Your festivals still run. Your philosophical schools still teach. Your theater still stages tragedies and comedies. But the decisions that actually shape your security, your trade relationships, and your long-term political future are being made in Rome by people who have never seen your city and may never see it. Ultimately, by a single man whose power is constrained only by the institutional habits of a political system you have no part in. It is the specific experience of political irrelevance within cultural continuity. And navigating that experience was what Greek intellectual life spent the Roman period doing. The Roman poet Horace, writing in the 1st century BCE, captured the cultural dimension of the conquest in a line that has been quoted ever since because it remains precisely accurate. Graecia capta ferum victorum cepit. Captive Greece captured its savage conqueror. What Horace meant was that the Roman ruling class underwent a cultural transformation under Greek influence that was as significant as anything the military conquest produced. Greek became the second language of every educated Roman, as essential as Latin to genuine intellectual life. Stoicism and Epicureanism became the frameworks within which Roman intellectuals understood their obligations and their place in the world. Greek rhetorical education became the foundation of Roman oratory. Greek artistic forms became the models against which Roman artistic production defined itself. The philosopher and politician Cicero, who lived from 106 to 43 BCE, was in fundamental respects a Greek intellectual writing in Latin. His philosophical works are adaptations and syntheses of Greek traditions, produced for a Roman audience that needed access to ideas that existed primarily in Greek. His political philosophy engages directly with Plato's Republic and Laws. His rhetorical theory builds on Aristotle's rhetoric. What Rome contributed to the exchange was not simply military power and administrative organization. Though both were consequential, Rome contributed the specific conditions under which Greek ideas could travel further and embed themselves more deeply than the Hellenistic period had allowed. Roman roads. Roman commercial networks operating consistently across a vast geographic area. Roman political stability. In its periods of genuine stability, these created infrastructure for the movement of ideas that the chronically warring successor kingdoms had not provided. The Greek language, already the common medium of educated exchange across the Hellenistic world, became, under Roman administration, the language of the entire educated Eastern Mediterranean in ways that were institutionally supported and commercially reinforced. When Paul of Tarsus wrote his letters to early Christian communities scattered across the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century CE, he wrote them in Greek. The New Testament was composed in Greek by writers whose intellectual formation mixed Jewish religious tradition with Hellenistic philosophical culture. For audiences whose shared medium was Greek, the specific form of Christianity that became dominant in the Roman Empire and eventually shaped Western civilization was constructed at every level, from the encounter between Jewish religious experience and Greek philosophical categories. The concept of the logos, the divine rational principle, that appears in the opening of the Gospel of John, was a Greek philosophical concept applied to a Jewish theological claim. The theological debates of the early church about the nature of Christ and the Trinity were conducted in Greek philosophical vocabulary because that vocabulary provided the most precise tools available for the distinctions those debates required. None of this would have been possible without the Greek philosophical tradition. None of it would have spread as it did without Roman infrastructure. The encounter between Greek ideas and Roman power produced something that neither could have produced independently. The physical monuments of Roman engagement with Greek culture are still visible. The Pantheon in Rome, built under the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, realizes a Greek architectural concept at Roman engineering scale. Hadrian himself, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE, was so devoted to Greek culture that Romans called him Graeculus, the Little Greek. He completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens, a project begun 6 centuries earlier and never finished, and built an arch in Athens, marking the boundary between the ancient city and the new construction the Roman period had added. The inscription on one side identifies the ancient city of Theseus. The inscription on the other side identifies the city of Hadrian, not Theseus. Hadrian was not replacing Athens. He was claiming a place in its history. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, the Greek-speaking Eastern Empire, which historians call Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years with its center at Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire preserved Greek language and Greek learning through the period when the Latin West lost access to most original Greek texts. When Renaissance humanists of the 14th and 15th centuries rediscovered Plato and Aristotle and the Greek tragedians, they were rediscovering texts that had survived in Byzantine libraries and in Arabic translations made by Islamic scholars who had encountered them through the same transmission chain. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 CE scattered Byzantine scholars across Western Europe with manuscripts, and is among the events historians identify as accelerating the Renaissance recovery of classical learning in the West. The Greeks had been conquered by Rome in 146 BCE, a version of the political entity they had created, carrying their language and their texts and their philosophical tradition, survived until 1453 CE. That is 1,600 years. Mummius burned the buildings. He could not burn the ideas. He shipped the artworks to Rome. In doing so, he delivered the aesthetic sensibility of the most intellectually productive civilization in the ancient world to the city that would become the capital of the Western world, and carry what it received forward into every civilization that grew from Rome's inheritance. Captive Greece captured its savage conqueror, and, through the conqueror, it captured every civilization that came after. Chapter 13. The Legacy. The ideas that still run the world. Here is a test you can run right now. Look at the building you are in. If you are in one, think about the last time you voted, or the last time someone told you that you had the right to vote. Think about the last argument you had or witnessed about what was fair. Think about the last time you watched a story, in any medium, about someone making a choice that destroyed them despite being genuinely capable and genuinely trying. Think about the last time someone told you to question your assumptions. Now ask where any of that came from. The columns on government buildings across the Western world are Greek in their origin, derived from architectural forms developed for Greek temples in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. The idea that ordinary people should have a vote is Greek in its conceptual foundation. Developed in Athens in 508 BCE by a politician trying to win a power struggle. The structure of serious drama, the protagonist of genuine worth facing an impossible choice whose consequences exceed their understanding, is Greek in its systematic development. Built by Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides for Athenian festival audiences 2,500 years ago, the instruction to question your assumptions is Socratic in its origin, rooted in a daily practice that got the man who developed it killed by a democratic vote. These are not metaphors. They are traceable historical connections between specific intellectual and institutional developments in ancient Greece and the specific forms those developments took as they traveled through Rome, through early Christianity, through the Islamic world's preservation and extension of Greek scientific and philosophical texts, through the Renaissance recovery of classical learning, through the Enlightenment political philosophy that shaped the founding documents of modern democracies, and into the world you currently inhabit. The historian Edith Hall, in her study of the ancient Greeks and their legacy, published in 2014, argues that the most important Greek contribution to subsequent civilization was not any specific idea or institution, but a habit of mind, a willingness to question received authority, a demand for reasons rather than simply tradition, a treatment of the world as something that can be understood through careful observation and logical reasoning rather than simply accepted as given. That habit of mind is what the pre-Socratic philosophers were practicing when they proposed natural explanations for natural phenomena. It is what Socrates was practicing in the Agora. It is what the tragedians were practicing when they refused to resolve their moral dilemmas neatly. It is what Thucydides was practicing when he explained the Peloponnesian War through human causes rather than divine will. That habit of mind did not originate exclusively in Greece. Babylonian astronomical traditions produced observational data of extraordinary precision. Indian mathematical traditions developed concepts Greek mathematics did not reach. Chinese philosophical traditions engaged questions of ethics and governance with comparable sophistication. What was distinctive about the Greek case was the specific combination of conditions we have traced through this entire story. The city-state's culture of public argument, where claiming something in the Agora meant defending it against challenge from anyone present. The writing down of law, which transformed legal authority from the expressed will of the powerful into something fixed and citable by anyone who could read. The colonization movement, which created comparative perspective by demonstrating that different communities had made different choices about the same fundamental questions. The democratic system, which made political participation a normal feature of male citizen life, and therefore made the justification of political decisions a permanent cultural practice. These conditions produced a specific kind of intellectual culture, and that culture, transmitted through the channels we have traced, is running in the background of almost every significant development in Western thought, from the Roman period to the present. Democracy is the most obvious legacy and the most discussed. The word is Greek. The concept in its modern form is not simply the Athenian institution transplanted. It is the product of a long development from Athenian origins through Roman republican practice. Medieval European representative traditions, the English constitutional struggles of the 17th century, and Enlightenment theories of natural rights that produced the American and French constitutional experiments. But the Athenian contribution to that development was not merely the word. It was a set of institutional inventions that established the practical possibility of popular self-governance at civic scale. Majority voting as a decision mechanism, random selection for distributing political responsibility across a citizen body, payment for civic participation as a tool for making engagement practically possible for people without independent wealth. These specific institutional ideas were available for later political thinkers to build on, criticize, and adapt because the Athenians practiced them, and because Athenian writers described and analyzed them with sufficient precision that the analysis survived. When James Madison was designing the institutional framework of the United States Constitution, he read Thucydides. He read Aristotle's Politics. He read Plutarch's biographies of Greek and Roman statesmen. The specific choices he made, the separation of powers, the system of checks and balances, the design of the Senate as a counterweight to the more directly popular House, were made partly in direct response to what Madison had read about Athenian democracy and thought carefully about in terms of why it failed when it failed. Madison was not imitating Athens. He was learning from it. That distinction matters. He admired Athenian democracy's civic energy and its commitment to participation. He feared its documented susceptibility to demagogues and its capacity for catastrophic collective decisions made in good faith by people who believed they were doing the right thing. The American Republic as Madison designed it reflects both the admiration and the fear simultaneously. Philosophy is the second great legacy, operating at a deeper level than institutional design because it shapes how people think about the most fundamental political and moral questions before they ever reach institutional design. The concept of natural rights, the idea that human beings possess certain entitlements by virtue of their rational nature that no political authority can legitimately override, was developed in the Stoic philosophical tradition, elaborated by Roman Stoic thinkers including Cicero and Marcus Aurelius, preserved and extended by Christian theologians who incorporated Stoic natural law theory into Christian moral philosophy, and then secularized by Enlightenment philosophers including John Locke, who removed the theological scaffolding while retaining the core argument. When the Declaration of Independence states that certain truths are self-evident and that all men are created equal with inalienable rights, it is operating within a philosophical tradition that traces through Locke and the Enlightenment, through Cicero and Roman Stoicism, through Zeno of Citium and the school he founded in Athens in 306 BCE. Remove the Stoic foundation, and the entire structure of natural rights argument loses its logical grounding, because the Stoics were the ones who developed the specific argument that rational nature is the basis of equal moral worth, which is the premise without which equal natural rights cannot be coherently argued. Science is the third great legacy, and the one whose consequences for contemporary life are most immediate and most material. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries CE was explicitly positioned by its practitioners as a recovery and extension of the Greek scientific and mathematical tradition. Copernicus knew about Aristarchus's heliocentric model. Galileo's mechanics built directly on Archimedes. Newton's mathematical framework drew on the geometric tradition that Euclid's Elements had transmitted across 2,000 years. The Greek contribution to the scientific revolution was not primarily a body of correct knowledge, because much of what the Greeks believed about the natural world was wrong. It was a methodological commitment. The commitment to finding natural explanations for natural phenomena. The commitment to building explanations from clearly stated premises through consistent logical reasoning. The commitment to treating the world as something the human mind can understand, rather than something that must simply be accepted. Most human cultures, across most of human history, have explained natural events through supernatural agency. The Greek philosophical tradition made the move to natural explanation and made it explicitly enough that it could be transmitted, debated, extended, and eventually developed into the scientific method that has transformed human knowledge and human capacity in ways no previous civilization approached. Euclid's Elements, compiled in Alexandria around 300 BCE, was used as the primary mathematics textbook in the Western world for over 2,000 years. The axiomatic method it established remains the method of pure mathematics today. Every mathematical proof written anywhere in the world operates within the methodological framework Euclid demonstrated. The Pythagorean theorem that every student learns has been continuously taught for 2,500 years. The dramatic legacy operates in the contemporary world in ways that are often invisible because they are so thoroughly embedded. The structure of serious drama in any medium. The protagonist of genuine worth and genuine complexity, who faces choices whose consequences exceed their understanding, and whose suffering generates not simple moral lessons, but the kind of recognition the Greeks called anagnorisis. Seeing clearly what was always the case, is the structure that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides developed and refined. When you watch a film in which a genuinely complex person makes decisions that make sense from the inside and produce consequences no one intended, you are watching a narrative form 2,500 years old. The medical tradition is easy to overlook, but runs through the practical life of the modern world in ways that matter concretely. Hippocrates of Kos, developed in the 5th century BCE, a medical practice explicitly committed to natural rather than supernatural causes of disease. The Hippocratic tradition explained illness as the result of natural processes that could be observed, classified, and treated through natural interventions. The specific theories were mostly wrong. The methodological commitment. Observe carefully. Reason from observation. Develop treatments based on natural understanding rather than ritual. Was transmitted through Hellenistic medicine, through the Roman physician, Galen, through the Islamic medical tradition that preserved and extended Greek medical knowledge, and into the European medical tradition that eventually produced modern clinical science. Every physician who practices evidence-based medicine today works within a methodological tradition that traces back to 5th century BCE Greece. Now step back from the specific legacies and return to the question this documentary began with. How did one small, fractured, frequently violent peninsula produce ideas so powerful that every civilization after it is still arguing about them? The answer, after traveling the entire length of this story, is that the conditions that made Greece seem most limited were precisely the conditions that made it most productive. The smallness was not a limitation. It was the source of the most important feature. In a polis of tens of thousands, politics was personal enough to be real. The agora was a space where argument mattered because the audience was present and had genuine stakes in the outcome. That specific condition, argument in public, before a present audience with real consequences, drove the development of logic and rhetoric and the philosophical tools for distinguishing good arguments from bad ones in ways that more abstract or more protected intellectual traditions did not develop. The competition between city-states was not a weakness. 250 years of competing police conducting their own political experiments created a comparative laboratory that no unified empire could have produced. You cannot develop sophisticated theories about the best political arrangement if only one arrangement has ever been tried. The Greeks had tried dozens, and they had writers of sufficient ability and honesty to record what each experiment had produced and what it had cost. The violence and the failure were not incidental to the achievement. They were part of its source. The Persian Wars gave the Greeks the ideological framework within which they understood their own political arrangements as valuable rather than simply normal. The Peloponnesian War gave them the most thoroughgoing examination of democratic failure that any civilization has ever conducted from inside the experience, producing in Thucydides a historical analysis of political dysfunction whose sophistication has not been surpassed. The execution of Socrates produced in Plato a philosophical response to the question of why free societies make catastrophically bad decisions that 2,500 years of subsequent political philosophy has not fully answered. The Greeks did not produce their ideas despite their difficulties. They produced them because of their difficulties. The specific pressure of the specific conditions generated the specific habit of mind that has been running through Western civilization ever since. And here is the final thing worth understanding. The thing that the highlight reel version of Greek history cannot give you. The ideas did not arrive clean. They were paid for. They were paid for in the suffering of helots who farmed land they did not own and were killed in the dark for showing signs of capability. They were paid for in the hemlock that Socrates drank with more equanimity than his friends could watch. They were paid for in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where tens of thousands of Athenian soldiers died for an assembly's belief in its own exceptionalism. They were paid for in the burned libraries of cities that chose the wrong answer to the question of whether to resist the army outside the walls. That price is part of what the ideas mean, not as justification, never as justification, but as the historical reality of how the most important political and philosophical tradition in Western civilization was actually built, by people trying to figure out, in conditions of real difficulty and real danger, how to live together and govern themselves and ask what was just and why. They did not fully succeed. The questions they asked most clearly remain unanswered. Every generation that inherits the democratic tradition discovers, as the Athenians discovered, that giving people the power to govern themselves does not automatically give them the wisdom to do it well. Every generation has to learn again what Thucydides understood, that brilliant arguments in service of bad ideas are more dangerous than simply bad arguments, because they are harder to recognize and harder to resist. The Parthenon is a ruin. The Athenian Empire is dust. The specific democracy that Cleisthenes built was overthrown, modified, absorbed, and eventually dissolved. The polis, as a form of political life, is gone. The questions the polis was built to answer are not gone. Who should have power? What justifies authority over other people? What do citizens owe each other? What do governments owe the governed? What is the relationship between individual freedom and collective obligation? How do you organize a community of people who have voices and opinions and genuine stakes in the outcome without collapsing into either tyranny or the particular paralysis of a majority that keeps voting itself disasters? These questions were being argued in the Agora of Athens in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE. They were being argued in the Roman Senate. They were being argued in the constitutional conventions of the 18th century CE. They are being argued right now. In legislatures and courtrooms and editorial pages and in conversations around tables in every country that inherited the tradition the Greeks initiated. The peninsula was small. The questions were not. And now that you have traveled the full length of this story, from the frozen shores of the Aegean in the Bronze Age to the ruins of Corinth in 146 BCE, from the agora where Socrates asked his questions to the courtroom where a democratic jury condemned him, from the plain of Marathon to the harbor of Syracuse, from the banks of the Hyphasis where Alexander turned back to the library of Alexandria where Eratosthenes measured the earth with a stick and a shadow. You know something the highlight reel cannot give you. You know that the ideas did not come cheap, that the civilization that produced them was brilliant and brutal and limited and extraordinary simultaneously, that the Parthenon and the Hemlock and the Sicilian disaster and the execution of Socrates were all produced by the same political system, the same people, the same specific arrangement of public argument and civic participation and democratic accountability that we have inherited and are still trying to understand. Both things were always true. The greatness and the failure were not opposites. They were expressions of the same intense, argument-driven, publicly engaged way of being a community, trying to answer at a scale and with a seriousness no previous civilization had attempted what it means for human beings to live together well. They did not fully succeed. No civilization has, but they asked the question clearly enough, honestly enough, and with enough institutional creativity that the asking has never stopped. Return to where we started. A community of perhaps 200 people on a hillside in central Greece. Sometime around 900 BCE, a difficult winter. No palace, no king, no writing, no umpire. Nothing that would lead an outside observer to expect anything remarkable. And a round of fire. In the dark. People arguing about what was fair. That argument is still going. You are living inside it. That is the entire history of ancient Greece.